You've been hurt by life before. You made plans, you had hope, you thought things would go a certain way, and then suddenly nothing happened like you expected. Doors closed, people changed, the timing fell apart, and now you sit there tired, confused, maybe even asking yourself, what am I supposed to do with this? Why does life keep moving against me? Why does everything feel so uncertain? The truth is, peace does not come from making life obey you. It comes from learning how to stop fighting what you cannot control. Buddhist wisdom has taught this for centuries. The deepest peace is not found in perfect plans, but in surrender, in softening, in trusting that even this moment has something to teach you, even if you cannot see it yet. Tonight, as you listen to these teachings, something will begin to loosen. The pressure in your chest will start to fade. Your mind will become quieter. Your heart will feel less trapped. And little by little you will remember that life does not need to follow your plan for it to still carry you somewhere meaningful. This is not just something to listen to before sleep. This is the beginning of a different way of living. Are you ready? Let's begin. And now something begins to shift quietly, not outside but within, because before anything in life can change the way it moves around you, something deeper has to change in the way you relate to what is already here. And this is where most people suffer without realizing it. Not because life is always harsh, but because the mind keeps pushing against what already exists, like trying to hold back the ocean with bare hands and slowly exhausting itself in the process. There is a kind of pain that does not come from what is happening, but from the constant whisper inside that says, this should not be happening. This was not the plan. This is not how it was supposed to go. And that quiet resistance builds pressure day after day until even small things begin to feel heavy and overwhelming, not because they are too big, but because the mind refuses to let them simply be. Right now, something in your life is probably not where you want it to be. Maybe a relationship feels distant. Maybe a goal has stalled. Maybe the future looks unclear and your mind keeps circling the same thoughts, trying to fix it. Control it, force it into shape, and each time it fails, it creates a deeper frustration, as if life itself is doing something wrong. But life is not arguing with you, only the mind is. When reality shows up, it does not shout, it does not demand, it simply presents itself as it is. And then waits. The struggle begins when the mind steps in and says, no, this is unacceptable, this must change, this cannot stay like this. And from that moment, suffering is born not from the situation, but from the argument against it. Think about how much energy is spent every day trying to mentally rewrite what has already happened, replaying conversations, wishing they went differently, holding on to expectations that no longer match what is real. And each time this happens, the body tightens, the breath becomes shallow, the heart feels heavier, as if carrying something that has no physical weight but still drains everything inside. This is the hidden cost of arguing with reality. It creates a life where nothing ever feels fully settled because the mind is always negotiating, always resisting, always trying to bend what already is into something else. Buddhist teachings point to a simple but deeply uncomfortable truth. Suffering is not only caused by pain, it is caused by the refusal to accept pain as part of life. And the more the mind resists, the more the pain expands, turning a single moment into a continuous experience. It is like being caught in the rain, and instead of seeking shelter or simply feeling the rain on your skin, the mind stands there shouting, "This should not be happening. The sky should be clear. I planned for sunshine." And while the rain continues, the real suffering comes from the refusal to let the moment exist without complaint. There is something almost invisible about this pattern because it feels so natural to want things to go your way, to expect life to follow a certain direction, to believe that if something feels uncomfortable, it must be wrong. And yet this belief quietly builds a prison where peace is always delayed, waiting for life to finally match your expectations. But life does not wait for your expectations. It moves in its own rhythm, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes clear, sometimes confusing. And when the mind cannot accept this rhythm, it begins to suffer. Not because life is against you, but because it refuses to move with what is already happening. Notice how often the phrase "this should not be happening" appears in your thoughts. It can be small, like getting stuck in traffic, or larger, like facing rejection, loss, or uncertainty, and each time that thought appears, it creates tension, not just mentally but physically, as if the body itself is bracing against reality. And the strange part is, reality does not feel that tension, only you do. The moment something happens, it simply exists, but the mind immediately adds layers of judgment, comparison, expectation, and resistance, turning a simple moment into a complicated experience filled with unnecessary suffering. This is where surrender begins, not as a grand act, but as a quiet decision to stop arguing with what already is, to see things clearly without the need to immediately change them. And this does not mean you like everything or that you agree with everything. It simply means you stop fighting the fact that it has already happened. There is a difference between wanting change and resisting what is present. Wanting change can be calm, focused, even hopeful, but resistance is tight, aggressive, and exhausting. It demands that reality be different before peace can exist. And that is where suffering takes root, because peace is always postponed, waiting for a condition that may never come. When the mind stops arguing, something unexpected happens. The situation may not change immediately, but the weight around it begins to lift. The tension softens, the breath deepens, and suddenly there is space where there was once pressure. This space is where clarity begins to grow, because when you are no longer fighting what is happening, you can actually see it for what it is, instead of what you wish it to be. And from that place, wiser decisions can be made, not from panic, not from frustration, but from understanding. Many people believe that if they accept reality, they will become passive or weak, but the opposite is true. Acceptance is what allows true strength to appear, because energy is no longer wasted on resistance. It becomes available for action, for growth, for moving forward in a way that is aligned instead of forced. Think of a river. It does not fight the rocks in its path. It flows around them, over time shaping them without effort. And this is the quiet power of surrender. It does not mean giving up. It means moving with life instead of against it. There is also a deep emotional layer to this kind of suffering, because when life does not go as planned, it often touches something deeper than the event itself. It touches identity, expectations, beliefs about who you are and where you thought you were going. And when those things are challenged, the mind reacts strongly, not just to protect the situation, but to protect the image it has built. This is why arguing with reality can feel so intense. It is not just about what is happening, it is about what it means, about what it says about your future, about your worth, about your control. And all of these interpretations create more suffering than the event itself. When surrender begins, these layers slowly loosen the mind. No longer needs to defend an image or force a narrative. It begins to rest in what is actually happening without turning it into a personal failure or a permanent problem. There is a quiet relief in this, because for the first time, you are not carrying the burden of making everything make sense. Immediately, you are not rushing to fix what is not ready to be fixed. You are not forcing clarity where there is still uncertainty. Instead, you are allowing life to unfold at its own pace while staying present with what is here. And this presence brings a different kind of peace, not the peace of everything being perfect, but the peace of no longer fighting what is imperfect. It is important to understand that surrender is not something that happens once, it is something that happens again and again, each time the mind begins to argue. Each time resistance appears, each time the thought "this should not be happening" arises. There is an opportunity to pause, to notice, to soften. And in that pause, something changes. Not outside, but inside. The grip loosens, the tension fades, and the moment becomes lighter, even if the situation remains the same. Over time, this practice creates a different relationship with life, one where challenges are not immediately seen as enemies, but as experiences, one where discomfort does not automatically turn into suffering. one where peace is not dependent on perfect conditions, but is available even in the middle of uncertainty. There is also a deeper layer of trust that begins to form when you stop arguing with reality, because you start to see that not everything needs to be controlled or understood immediately. Sometimes things unfold in ways that only make sense later. Sometimes what feels like a setback becomes a redirection. Sometimes what feels like loss creates space for something new. But this can only be seen when the mind is no longer clouded by resistance, when it is quiet enough to observe instead of react. Right now, there may still be parts of you that want to hold on to the argument, that believe if you stop resisting, something will be lost, or that acceptance means defeat. And this is natural because the mind has been trained to protect control and certainty. But slowly, gently, it can learn something new. It can learn that letting go of the argument does not mean losing yourself. It means freeing yourself from unnecessary suffering. It means allowing life to be what it is, while you remain steady within it. And in that steadiness there is a quiet strength that does not depend on outcomes, that does not break when plans fall apart, that does not collapse when things go differently than expected. This strength is not loud, it does not demand attention. It simply exists as a calm presence that can face whatever comes without needing to fight it. So as this understanding settles in, there is nothing you need to force, nothing you need to change immediately. Just a simple awareness of how often the mind argues with reality, and a gentle willingness to step out of that argument even for a moment. Because sometimes the greatest relief does not come from fixing the situation, but from ending the inner conflict around it. And in that ending, a new kind of peace begins to appear, one that does not depend on life going your way, but on your ability to meet life as it is. And from here, everything begins to shift quietly, naturally, without force, because when the struggle inside softens, life itself begins to feel lighter. Not because it has changed, but because you have stopped fighting what was never yours to control in the first place. And as that quiet understanding begins to settle, something else starts to reveal itself beneath the surface. Because even after the mind stops arguing with what is already happening, there is still another hidden struggle that continues silently. The need to control what has not even arrived yet, the future that has not taken shape, the outcomes that exist only in thought but still manage to create real pressure inside the body. There is a tension that does not come from the present moment at all. It comes from what might happen, what could go wrong, what needs to be secured before anything even unfolds. And this tension slowly builds until the mind is no longer living here but somewhere ahead, trying to manage events that do not yet exist. A quiet fear begins to rise when the future feels uncertain, and the mind responds the only way it knows how, by trying to take control, by planning harder, thinking faster, predicting every possible outcome, as if enough effort could guarantee safety, as if enough thinking could remove all risk. But something starts to break inside when this pattern continues. It does not break suddenly, it collapses slowly, like a structure carrying too much weight, because the mind was never designed to control time itself. It was never meant to hold every possible version of the future and shape it into certainty, and yet it tries, again and again, believing that control will bring peace. The truth is, the opposite happens. The more the mind tries to control the future, the less stable it becomes, because it is constantly dealing with something that cannot be fully known, something that keeps shifting, something that refuses to stay still long enough to be managed. And this creates a quiet form of exhaustion, not from physical effort, but from mental overreach, from stretching awareness too far beyond what is real, trying to grab hold of what has not even arrived. There is a deep discomfort in not knowing what comes next, and instead of allowing that uncertainty to exist, the mind rushes to fill it with plans, predictions, expectations, building entire realities out of thought alone, and then holding on to them as if they must happen. This is where the collapse begins, not because the future is dangerous, but because the attachment to controlling it becomes too heavy to carry. Notice how often the mind moves ahead, trying to secure an outcome before it unfolds, thinking if this happens, then I will be okay. If this goes wrong, then everything will fall apart, constantly creating conditions for peace that depend on something external happening in a certain way. And every time those conditions are not met, there is frustration, anxiety, even fear, not because life has failed, but because the imagined version of the future did not match reality. This is the hidden trap of control. It creates a world inside the mind that feels real, but has no foundation in the present moment. And when reality does not follow that script, the mind experiences it as loss. It is like building a house in the air and then feeling pain when it cannot be lived in. The deeper issue is not the uncertainty itself. It is the belief that uncertainty must be removed before peace can exist, and this belief keeps the mind in a constant state of tension, always reaching forward, never resting. Buddhist teachings offer a different perspective, one that does not try to eliminate uncertainty, but instead changes the relationship with it, showing that the need to control the future is not a solution, but a source of suffering. There is a quiet strength in allowing the future to remain open, in recognizing that not everything needs to be decided right now, that not every outcome needs to be predicted, that life can unfold without being tightly managed at every step. This does not mean becoming careless or passive. It means acting with awareness in the present without clinging to what has not yet formed. It means making decisions without demanding that they guarantee a certain result. Because no matter how much planning is done, life will always contain unknowns. And trying to remove them completely is like trying to stop the wind from moving. The mind often confuses control with safety, believing that if everything is planned and predicted, then nothing can go wrong. But life does not operate within those limits. It moves in ways that cannot always be anticipated. And when the mind is attached to control, every unexpected turn feels like a threat. Every delay feels like failure. Every change feels like something has gone wrong, even when it may simply be part of a larger unfolding. This creates a fragile state where peace depends on everything going according to plan, and since life rarely follows a fixed script, peace becomes rare, temporary, easily disrupted. There is also a deeper emotional layer to this need for control, often rooted in fear, fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of not being enough, and these fears drive the mind to seek certainty in the future as a way to protect itself. But the protection it seeks is never fully achieved, because the future cannot be locked into place, and so the mind keeps trying, repeating the same effort, hoping for a different result. This repetition slowly drains energy, creating a sense of inner collapse, not visible on the outside, but deeply felt within. A kind of mental fatigue that makes even simple things feel heavy. The irony is that the more control is pursued, the less stable the inner state becomes, because the mind is constantly dealing with possibilities instead of realities, constantly preparing for things that may never happen. And in doing so, it loses connection with what is actually here. Surrender in this context is not about abandoning responsibility, it is about releasing the illusion that the future can be fully controlled. It is about recognizing the limits of thought and allowing life to unfold without constant interference. There is a quiet relief in this shift, because the mind no longer has to carry the impossible task of managing everything that has not yet happened. Instead, attention returns to the present, to what can actually be seen, felt, responded to in real time. This creates a different kind of stability, one that is not based on certainty, but on presence, on the ability to meet whatever arises without needing it to be prearranged. It also changes the way decisions are made, because when the mind is not overwhelmed by trying to control outcomes, it becomes clearer, more grounded, able to act without fear, driving every choice. There is a calmness that begins to replace urgency, a sense that not everything needs to be figured out immediately, that life can be navigated step by step instead of all at once. This does not remove challenges, but it removes the added weight of trying to control every possible direction those challenges might take. Over time, trust begins to grow, not blind trust, but a quiet confidence that even without full control, life can still be handled, that whatever comes can be met, that not knowing does not mean being unprepared. This trust is very different from the fragile security that control tries to create, because it does not depend on outcomes. It depends on the ability to remain steady regardless of how things unfold. And this steadiness becomes a kind of inner anchor, something that holds even when the future feels unclear. There is also a deep freedom in letting go of control, because the mind is no longer confined to a single version of how things must happen. It becomes open to possibilities, to paths that were not planned, to outcomes that could not have been predicted. Sometimes what is not controlled turns out to be more aligned than what was forced. But this can only be seen when there is space for it to appear. Holding too tightly to one outcome closes off everything else, creating a narrow path where anything outside of expectation feels like failure. But when control loosens, life becomes wider, more flexible, less rigid, and within that openness, there is less pressure, less fear, more ease. The shift is subtle but powerful. It does not change the external world immediately, but it changes the way the world is experienced, and that changes everything. The mind no longer needs to rush ahead, no longer needs to secure every outcome. It can rest in the present, move with what is real, and allow the future to unfold without constant interference. And in that letting go, the collapse that once felt inevitable begins to reverse, not through force, but through release. Because the weight was never meant to be carried in the first place, and once it is set down, even for a moment, there is a glimpse of what it feels like to be free from the constant need to control what has not yet arrived. And that glimpse becomes the beginning of a different way of living, one where trust replaces tension, where presence replaces prediction, where life is no longer something to be controlled, but something to be experienced, one moment at a time. And as that sense of control begins to loosen, something even more subtle comes into view, something that often hides behind ambition, behind discipline, behind the quiet pressure to move forward faster than life is actually unfolding, the silent force that tries to bend time itself into a shape that feels acceptable. There is a tension that does not always feel aggressive, yet it carries a sharp edge beneath it. The feeling that things are taking too long, that progress should already be visible, that life is somehow behind schedule, and this pressure begins to push from within, not loudly, but persistently, like a constant tightening that never fully relaxes. A quiet frustration starts to build when life does not move according to personal timing, when results delay, when answers do not arrive on cue, when growth feels slower than expected, and instead of allowing that pace, something inside begins to push harder, demand more, accelerate what is not ready to move. This is where the hidden violence begins. It does not look like anger on the surface. It often looks like effort, like persistence, like trying to stay ahead. But underneath, there is a refusal to respect the natural unfolding of things, a belief that everything should happen when the mind decides it should. And when that belief meets reality, friction appears. This friction is not always visible, but it is deeply felt, a kind of inner pressure that turns patience into irritation, that transforms waiting into suffering, that makes time itself feel like an enemy instead of a neutral space where things develop. There is something unnatural about forcing life to match a timeline that was created in thought alone, Because life does not operate on fixed schedules. It moves through cycles, through conditions, through countless variables that cannot all be controlled or predicted. Yet, the mind insists on its own clock, measuring progress, comparing speed, deciding what should have already happened, and each time reality does not match that expectation, there is a quiet clash. This clash creates stress, not because something is wrong, but because something is being pushed beyond its natural rhythm. Think about how often there is a feeling of being late, even when there is no real deadline. How often the thought appears that things should already be different, that life should have reached a certain point by now, and this thought alone creates a sense of urgency that does not come from the present moment, but from an imagined schedule. This urgency begins to affect everything. Decisions become rushed, actions become forced, rest feels undeserved, and even moments that could be peaceful are filled with a subtle pressure to be somewhere else, to become something else, to arrive sooner than is actually possible. There is a deep misunderstanding hidden here, the belief that life must align with personal timing in order to feel right, and when it does not, the response is to push harder, to demand more, to speed things up. But forcing growth does not create real progress. It creates strain. Just like pulling on a plant does not make it grow faster. It only damages its roots. Pushing life beyond its natural pace often leads to burnout, confusion, and a deeper sense of disconnection. The violence in this is not physical, it is internal. It is the constant refusal to allow things to unfold as they are. The quiet rejection of the present moment because it does not match an expectation. And over time, this creates a kind of inner harshness, a lack of compassion toward oneself, a feeling that nothing is ever enough because it is never happening fast enough. Buddhist teachings bring attention to this subtle aggression, not to criticize it, but to reveal it, to show that the suffering does not come from the pace of life, but from the demand that it be different. There is a softness that begins to emerge when this demand is seen clearly, a recognition that not everything can be rushed, that some things require time, that some phases cannot be skipped. This softness is not weakness, it is a form of intelligence, a way of aligning with life instead of trying to overpower it. When the need to control timing begins to fade, there is a shift in how time itself is experienced. It no longer feels like something to chase or fight against. It becomes something to move with. Moments begin to open instead of feeling compressed. Actions become more intentional instead of reactive, and there is less urgency to prove that something is happening right now. This creates space for a different kind of growth, one that is steady, grounded, not driven by pressure, but by presence. There is also a deep emotional layer connected to timelines, because often the urgency is tied to identity, to where you think you should be in life, to comparisons with others, to expectations that were formed long ago. When those expectations are not met, it can feel like falling behind, like something is wrong, like life is not unfolding correctly, and this feeling intensifies the pressure, creating a cycle where the more behind you feel, the more you try to force things forward, and the more you force, the more strained everything becomes. Breaking this cycle requires a different perspective, one that does not measure life against a fixed timeline, but sees it as a process that unfolds uniquely for each person, without a universal schedule that must be followed. There is a quiet freedom in releasing the idea that there is a specific time when things must happen, because without that rigid structure, there is less pressure to rush, less fear of being late, less need to constantly evaluate progress. Instead, attention shifts to what is actually happening, to the steps that can be taken now, without the weight of needing them to immediately lead somewhere specific. This does not mean there are no goals or direction, it means those goals are held lightly, without forcing reality to match them at a certain speed. It allows effort without aggression, movement without tension, growth without comparison. And in this way, the relationship with time becomes less stressful, less rigid, more fluid. There is also a deeper trust that begins to develop, a recognition that not everything needs to happen immediately to be meaningful, that delays are not always obstacles, that timing is often connected to factors that cannot be seen in the moment. This trust does not come from certainty. It comes from letting go of the need to control when things happen and allowing them to unfold in their own way. There is a kind of patience that grows from this, not forced patience, but a natural ease with the pace of things, a willingness to stay present even when results are not immediate. This patience reduces the inner pressure that once drove everything, creating a calmer state where actions are no longer fueled by urgency but by clarity. Over time, this shift changes how life is experienced, because instead of constantly feeling like something is missing or delayed, there is a sense of being where you are supposed to be, not because everything is perfect, but because there is no longer a fight against the current moment. This does not remove desire or ambition. It transforms them, making them less rigid, less demanding, more aligned with reality. It allows movement forward without the need to control exactly when the destination is reached. And in this way, the hidden violence begins to dissolve, replaced by a gentler way of living, one that respects the natural unfolding of life instead of trying to dominate it. Because when the pressure to force time disappears, something else takes its place, a quiet rhythm, a steady flow, a sense that things are moving even when they are not visible, that growth is happening even when it is not obvious. And within that rhythm, there is less struggle, less frustration, more space to breathe, more room to simply be. Life no longer feels like something that must be chased or forced into shape. It becomes something that can be experienced fully without the constant need to make it happen faster. And in that shift, there is a kind of peace that was never available while everything was being pushed. A peace that does not depend on speed, but on alignment, on allowing life to move as it does, without turning time into an enemy. This is where surrender deepens, not as an idea, but as a lived experience, a quiet acceptance of the pace of things, a release of the need to control when everything happens, and a gentle return to the present moment where life is already unfolding, without needing to be forced. And from here, something new becomes possible, a way of living that is not driven by pressure, but guided by awareness, where time is no longer something to fight, but something to move with, naturally, steadily, without violence. And as that pressure to force time begins to soften, something quieter starts to appear, something that was always there but often ignored, the simple truth that not everything in life is meant to be finished right now, not everything is meant to be clear, not everything is meant to make sense in the moment it is being lived. There is a kind of discomfort that rises when things remain incomplete, when answers do not arrive, when progress feels invisible, when life seems paused in a place that does not offer resolution, and the mind immediately labels this as a problem, something to fix, something to escape. But what if this unfinished space is not a mistake? What if this is part of the design? There are seasons in life that do not look like growth on the surface. They do not bring obvious results. They do not give immediate clarity, and because of that, they are often misunderstood as stagnation or failure. The mind struggles here because it prefers movement. It can see, results it can measure, change it can confirm, but not all transformation works that way. Some of the deepest shifts happen quietly, beneath the surface, without visible signs, without clear direction, without immediate reward. And this creates a tension between what is happening internally and what appears externally. It feels like nothing is moving, yet something subtle is changing. This is the nature of an unfinished season. It is a phase where life is still forming, still arranging, still preparing something that cannot yet be fully seen, and because it is not complete, it feels uncertain. The mind often reacts by trying to close this uncertainty, by searching for answers, by pushing for resolution, by wanting to skip ahead to the part where everything is clear. But rushing through an unfinished season is like trying to read the last page of a book before the story has unfolded. It removes the depth, the meaning, the process that gives the outcome its value. There is a kind of wisdom hidden in not knowing, a quiet intelligence in allowing things to remain open, in resisting the urge to force conclusions before they are ready. Buddhist teachings often point to this space as a place of potential, not because it feels comfortable, but because it holds possibilities that have not yet been shaped. When everything is unfinished, everything is still possible. But the mind does not always see it that way. It sees the lack of completion as a lack of control, as something missing, as something wrong, and so it begins to search for certainty, for something solid to hold on to. This search creates anxiety because certainty is not always available in these phases. The more the mind looks for it, the more it feels its absence. And this is where trust becomes important, not blind trust, but a quiet willingness to stay present even when the path is not fully visible. Trusting the wisdom of an unfinished season means allowing life to unfold without demanding immediate answers. It means staying with the process instead of constantly trying to jump to the outcome. This kind of trust does not remove discomfort, but it changes the way discomfort is experienced. Instead of being seen as something wrong, it becomes something natural, part of the unfolding, part of the growth that is happening beneath the surface. There is also a deeper emotional layer here, because unfinished seasons often bring up feelings of doubt, of questioning whether things will work out, of wondering if time is being wasted. These thoughts create pressure. They make the moment feel heavier. They turn uncertainty into something threatening. But these thoughts are not the truth of the situation. They are responses to not knowing. And when they are seen clearly, they begin to lose their grip. There is a quiet strength in allowing something to remain incomplete without trying to rush it into form, a patience that does not come from waiting for something to happen, but from being fully present with what is already here. This patience is not passive. It is active in a different way. It is attentive, aware, open to subtle changes that might otherwise be missed. In an unfinished season, small shifts matter, small insights, small changes in perspective, small movements that are easy to overlook because they do not immediately lead to a visible result. But these small movements are often part of a larger process that is still forming. There is also a natural rhythm to life that includes periods of growth and periods of stillness, times of clarity and times of confusion, times of movement and times of pause. When this rhythm is not respected, when stillness is seen as a problem instead of a phase, it creates unnecessary resistance. But when stillness is allowed, when it is trusted as part of the process, it becomes less uncomfortable, less threatening. It becomes a space where things can settle, where understanding can deepen, where something new can quietly take shape. There is also a tendency to compare these seasons to others, to look at people who seem to be moving forward, achieving, progressing, and feel that something is wrong because your own path feels unclear. But comparison only intensifies the discomfort, because it shifts attention away from what is actually happening within your own experience. Each path unfolds differently. Each season has its own timing, and trying to measure one against another creates confusion instead of clarity. Trusting an unfinished season requires letting go of that comparison, returning attention to your own process, even if it feels slower, even if it feels unclear. There is a kind of humility in this, a recognition that not everything can be understood immediately, that not everything can be controlled or predicted. This humility opens space for learning, for deeper awareness, for a more grounded relationship with life. It allows you to move through uncertainty without needing to resolve it instantly. There is also a quiet resilience that develops in these seasons, because staying present with uncertainty builds a kind of inner stability that does not depend on external clarity. It strengthens the ability to remain steady even when things are not fully known. This stability becomes important later because life will always include moments of uncertainty, and learning to stay grounded in those moments reduces suffering. Over time, something begins to shift in the way unfinished seasons are experienced. They no longer feel like interruptions. They begin to feel like part of the path, not separate from it. They become spaces where growth is happening in ways that are not immediately visible, where something deeper is being prepared. And when this is understood, there is less urgency to escape them, less pressure to force resolution. There is more willingness to stay, to observe, to allow things to unfold. This does not mean doing nothing. It means acting where action is needed without trying to control the outcome. It means moving forward while accepting that not everything will be clear at every step. There is also a sense of trust that begins to grow, not because everything is known, but because there is an understanding that not knowing is part of the process. This trust reduces the fear that often comes with uncertainty. It creates a quieter state where the mind is not constantly searching for answers. Instead, it becomes more receptive, more open, more able to notice what is actually happening rather than what it thinks should be happening. In this openness, something important becomes possible, a deeper connection to the present moment, a more direct experience of life as it is, without the constant need to define it. And in that experience, there is a kind of peace that does not depend on completion, a calm that exists even while things are still forming. This is the quiet wisdom of unfinished seasons. They teach patience without forcing it. They deepen awareness without demanding it. They open space without explaining it. And while they may not feel comfortable, they carry a depth that finished moments often do not, because they invite you to stay with the unknown, to explore it, to learn from it. As this understanding settles, the need to rush begins to fade. The pressure to resolve everything immediately softens, and in its place there is a quiet acceptance of the process, a willingness to trust that even in its unfinished state, life is still moving, still shaping, still unfolding in ways that are not yet visible. And within that unfolding, there is meaning, there is growth, there is something forming that cannot be forced, only allowed. This is where surrender deepens again, not as giving up, but as staying present with what is incomplete, without turning it into something wrong, without needing it to be finished before it can be accepted. And from this place, life begins to feel less like something that must be controlled, and more like something that can be experienced, even in its most uncertain moments, even when nothing is fully clear. Because sometimes the most important parts of the journey are the ones that are still being written, the ones that are not yet finished, the ones that require trust, not because they are easy, but because they are still unfolding. And as that quiet acceptance of unfinished seasons begins to take root, something deeper starts to surface, something that has been reacting beneath everything all along, something that does not like uncertainty, does not like delay, does not like not being in charge. There is a part of you that feels disturbed when life does not follow your direction, when outcomes shift, when people act in ways you did not expect, when plans fall apart. And this disturbance is not just discomfort, it is a kind of panic. It is subtle at first, but it grows quickly. There is a tightening in the chest, a rush of thoughts trying to explain what went wrong, a strong urge to regain control, to fix, to correct, to bring things back into alignment with what was supposed to happen. But beneath all of that movement, there is something deeper being touched. It is not just the situation that feels threatened, it is identity. The ego builds a sense of self based on expectations, roles, plans, and the belief that life should reflect those internal structures. And when life does not cooperate, it feels like something personal has been disrupted. There is a quiet assumption that things should go a certain way because you planned them, because you worked for them, because you believed in them. And when that assumption is broken, it does not just feel like an external failure, it feels like a crack in the image you have of yourself. This is where the panic begins. It is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it appears as overthinking, as restlessness, as an inability to sit still with what is happening. Sometimes it shows up as frustration, as blame, as a need to find something or someone responsible. And sometimes it becomes a deeper sense of loss, not just of what happened, but of what it meant about you. The ego does not like unpredictability because it cannot control it. It does not like being wrong because it identifies with being right. It does not like being uncertain because it builds its sense of security on knowing. So when life refuses to obey, it reacts. It tries to regain control through thought, through effort, through resistance. But this reaction only creates more tension. The more the ego tries to force life back into place, the more it feels the gap between expectation and reality, and that gap becomes painful. It is like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you grip, the more it slips away. There is a deep exhaustion in this pattern because it never fully resolves. Even when things seem to go right for a while, the ego remains alert, waiting, anticipating the next disruption, trying to stay ahead of what might go wrong. And this constant vigilance creates a fragile state where peace depends on everything staying under control. But life does not stay under control. It moves, it changes, it surprises. And each time it does, the ego feels challenged again. This creates a cycle where peace is always temporary, always dependent on conditions, always at risk. Buddhist teachings bring attention to this cycle, not to remove the ego completely, but to loosen its grip, to see it clearly for what it is, a structure of thought that tries to create stability through control. When this is seen, something begins to shift. The panic does not disappear instantly, but it becomes more visible. It can be observed instead of immediately believed. There is a moment where the reaction is noticed, where the urge to control is seen as a response, not as a necessity. And in that moment, there is a small space. That space is important, because within it, there is a choice, not a forced choice, not something that has to be decided quickly, but a quiet awareness that the reaction does not have to be followed. This awareness begins to weaken the automatic patterns that drive the panic. Instead of immediately trying to fix everything, there is a pause. Instead of rushing to regain control, there is a noticing of the urge to do so. This does not mean doing nothing. It means responding from a place that is not driven by fear. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form, that life not obeying is not a personal attack. It is not happening to challenge your identity. It is simply unfolding according to its own conditions. This understanding softens the intensity of the reaction because it removes the sense of personal failure. The situation is no longer seen as something that went wrong because of you, but as something that is part of a larger movement that cannot always be controlled. This shift reduces the need to defend, to justify, to correct everything immediately. It creates a calmer space where things can be seen more clearly. There is also a release of the need to always be right, to always have things go according to plan. This release is not easy because the ego holds tightly to its ideas of how things should be, but when those ideas are loosened, there is less resistance when reality does not match them. There is more flexibility, more openness to what is actually happening. This flexibility allows for a different kind of strength, not the strength of control, but the strength of adaptability. the ability to move with life instead of constantly trying to shape it. This does not mean losing direction or purpose. It means holding them lightly, allowing them to guide without forcing them to define every outcome. There is also a deeper emotional freedom that begins to develop. Because when the ego is not constantly reacting to every disruption, there is less emotional turbulence. There is less need to constantly adjust, fix, or correct. There is more space to simply experience what is happening without turning it into something personal. This space creates a kind of inner stability that does not depend on external conditions. It allows you to remain grounded even when things change. It also reduces the intensity of disappointment, because expectations are not held as tightly. They are still there, but they do not define your sense of self. So when they are not met, the impact is softer. There is less collapse, less panic. Over time, this changes the relationship with life. Instead of seeing it as something that must obey, it becomes something that can be engaged with, responded to, learned from. There is less need to control and more willingness to trust. Not a blind trust, but a grounded understanding that not everything needs to go according to plan for things to work out. This trust grows slowly, through repeated experiences of letting go of control and seeing that life continues, that things still move, that not everything falls apart. And each time this happens, the ego's grip loosens a little more. The panic becomes less intense, less frequent. There is also a deeper sense of humility that begins to appear, a recognition that not everything can be known, that not everything can be managed. This humility is not weakness, it is a form of clarity. It allows you to see the limits of control and to work within them instead of constantly pushing against them. This reduces frustration because there is less expectation that things must be a certain way. There is more acceptance of what is. And in that acceptance, there is less conflict. The mind becomes quieter, not because everything is resolved, but because it is no longer constantly reacting. There is also a deeper connection to the present moment, because when the ego is not projecting into the future or reacting to unmet expectations, attention naturally returns to what is happening now. And in that return, there is a sense of groundedness, a feeling of being here rather than constantly being pulled somewhere else. This groundedness creates a different kind of peace, not dependent on outcomes, not fragile, not easily disrupted, a steady presence that remains even when things do not go as planned. As this becomes more familiar, the need for life to obey begins to fade. It is no longer seen as necessary for peace. It is no longer the condition for feeling okay. Instead, there is a growing comfort with uncertainty, with change, with things not always aligning perfectly. And in that comfort, there is freedom. Freedom from the constant need to control, from the panic when things go differently, from the pressure to maintain a certain image or outcome. This freedom does not remove challenges, but it changes how they are experienced. They become part of the flow of life rather than disruptions to it. And in this way, the ego's panic slowly transforms, not by force, not by suppression, but by understanding, by seeing it clearly, by not feeding it, by allowing it to pass without becoming it. And in that process, something deeper begins to take its place. A quieter awareness, a steadier presence, a way of being that is not shaken by every change, a way of meeting life that does not require it to obey, but simply allows it to be. And from that place, something unexpected happens. Life may still be uncertain, still unpredictable, still unfolding in ways that cannot be controlled, but it no longer feels like something that must be fought. It becomes something that can be lived moment by moment, without the constant need to make it match an idea. And in that shift, there is a peace that was never available when everything had to be controlled, a peace that remains, even when life refuses to obey. And as that grip of control begins to loosen and the panic of the ego starts to fade, something unexpected comes into view. Something that once felt like pure loss begins to reveal a different side, something quieter, something deeper, something that was hidden beneath the collapse itself. Because when a plan falls apart, it does not just remove direction, it removes certainty. It removes the structure the mind was leaning on. And in that moment, there is often a sharp drop, a feeling of emptiness, confusion, even disappointment that can feel heavier than the situation itself. There is a silence that follows the collapse of a plan. Not a peaceful silence at first, but a kind of disorientation, like standing in a place that no longer looks familiar, where the next step is not clear, where the path that once felt solid has suddenly disappeared. And the mind reacts quickly. It searches for a replacement, a new plan, a new direction, something to fill the gap, because staying in that space feels uncomfortable, uncertain, exposed. But what if that space is not something to escape? What if that space is where something important begins? Most people experience the collapse of a plan as failure, as something going wrong, as a sign that something has been lost. And while there may be real loss involved, there is also something else happening at the same time, something that is often overlooked because the focus is only on what is no longer there. When a plan collapses, it removes the illusion that life must follow a specific path. It breaks the attachment to a fixed outcome, and in doing so, it opens a space that was not available before. This space can feel empty, but it is not empty in a negative sense. It is open, it is unformed, it is no longer limited by the structure that was holding it. And within that openness, there is a possibility for awareness to arise in a way that is not shaped by expectation. There is a kind of clarity that can only appear when the mind is no longer focused on making something happen. Because as long as a plan is in place, attention is often directed toward the future, toward results, toward progress. But when that plan falls apart, attention has nowhere to go but here. And in that return to the present, something becomes visible that was previously overlooked. The mind, which was once occupied with controlling outcomes, begins to notice what is actually happening. Thoughts become clearer, emotions become more visible. Patterns that were hidden beneath constant movement start to reveal themselves. This is the beginning of awareness, not as an idea, but as a direct experience. A seeing of what is, without the filter of what should be. There is also a shift in how identity is experienced during this process. Because often, plans are not just external goals, they are connected to how you see yourself. Who you thought you were becoming, what you believed your life would look like. And when those plans collapse, that identity is shaken. This can feel destabilizing because it removes a sense of direction and certainty. But it also creates an opportunity to see beyond that identity. To recognize that who you are is not limited to the roles or outcomes you had in mind. This recognition is not immediate. It unfolds slowly. It requires staying with the discomfort of not knowing, of not rushing to rebuild a new identity immediately. Because if the mind moves too quickly to replace the old plan, it may recreate the same patterns, the same attachments, the same expectations that led to the collapse in the first place. Allowing the space to remain open, even for a while, creates room for something deeper to emerge, something that is not built from fear or urgency, but from clarity. There is also a different kind of learning that happens when a plan collapses. Not the kind that comes from success or achievement, but the kind that comes from direct experience. From seeing what did not work, from understanding where attachment was strong, from recognizing the assumptions that were being made. This learning is not always comfortable, but it is valuable. It provides insight that cannot be gained through planning alone. It reveals how the mind operates, how it creates expectations, how it reacts when those expectations are not met. And through this understanding, there is a chance to relate to life differently, to approach future actions with more awareness, with less attachment, with a clearer sense of what can and cannot be controlled. There is also a release that begins to happen. Because holding on to a plan requires effort, it requires maintaining a certain direction, a certain expectation. And when that plan collapses, that effort is no longer needed in the same way. There is a letting go that can occur, not forced, but natural, as the mind realizes it no longer needs to hold on to something that is no longer there. This release creates a sense of lightness, not because everything is resolved, but because something heavy has been set down. There is more space, more room to breathe, more room to see, and in that space, new possibilities can begin to appear, not as fixed outcomes, but as directions that are not yet fully formed. This is where awareness becomes important. Because without it, the mind may rush to fill the space with something familiar, something that feels safe. But with awareness, there is a chance to observe these tendencies, to notice the urge to quickly rebuild, to recognize when action is coming from fear rather than clarity. This recognition allows for a different kind of movement, one that is not driven by the need to replace what was lost, but by a genuine understanding of what is needed now. There is also a deeper trust that can develop through this process. A trust that even when things fall apart, something continues. That life does not stop. That movement is still possible, even without a clear plan. This trust is not based on knowing exactly what will happen next. It is based on the experience of having gone through uncertainty and still being here, still able to respond, still able to move forward. This creates a kind of inner confidence, not in controlling outcomes, but in the ability to meet whatever arises. There is also a shift in how success and failure are understood. Because when awareness grows, the focus moves away from whether a plan worked or not, and towards what was learned, what was seen, what changed internally. This does not remove the desire for progress or achievement, but it changes the way they are held. They are no longer the sole measure of value. They become part of a larger process that includes growth, understanding, and awareness. Over time, the collapse of a plan is no longer seen only as an ending. It is also seen as a beginning. Not because everything immediately becomes clear, but because something new has been opened, something that was not visible before. And this new beginning is not defined by a specific outcome. It is defined by a different way of relating to life, one that includes uncertainty, that allows for change, that does not depend entirely on plans working out as expected. This way of relating creates more flexibility, more resilience, more openness to what is. It reduces the fear of things going wrong because there is an understanding that even when they do, something valuable can still emerge. There is also a deeper sense of presence that develops, because without a fixed plan directing attention toward the future, there is more awareness of what is happening now. This presence brings a kind of calm, not because everything is easy, but because there is less mental movement away from the moment, less resistance, less need to be somewhere else. And in that calm, decisions can be made more clearly. Actions can be taken without the same level of pressure. There is more alignment between what is happening internally and what is happening externally. This alignment creates a sense of flow, a feeling that life is moving, even without a clear map. And this movement is not forced, it is natural. It follows what is available in the moment, rather than trying to create something that is not yet ready. As this becomes more familiar, the fear of plans collapsing begins to decrease, not because it becomes desirable, but because it is no longer seen as purely negative. It is understood as part of the process, as something that can lead to deeper awareness, as something that can open new directions. This understanding does not remove all discomfort, but it changes the way discomfort is experienced. It becomes something that can be observed, learned from, moved through, rather than something that must be avoided at all costs. And in this way, the collapse of a plan becomes less of a threat and more of a turning point. A moment where something shifts, not always externally, but internally, where awareness deepens, where attachment loosens, where a different relationship with life begins to form. This relationship is not based on certainty, it is based on presence. On the ability to stay with what is happening without needing it to immediately become something else. And from that place, something new can begin. Not as a reaction to what was lost, but as a response to what is now possible. And that possibility was not visible before. It only appeared when the plan fell apart, when the structure was removed, when the mind was forced to let go, even if only for a moment. And in that moment, awareness was born, not as something created, but as something revealed. Something that was always there, but hidden beneath the constant movement of planning and controlling. And now, with that movement slowed, with that control loosened, it becomes clearer, more present, more available. And from that awareness, life can be lived in a different way, not controlled, not forced, but seen, understood, and responded to with a deeper sense of clarity and calm. And this is where surrender continues to unfold, not as giving up, but as allowing the collapse of what was imagined to reveal what is real. And as that awareness begins to deepen, something even more personal starts to come into view, something that does not just live in plans or outcomes, but in the quiet story you have been telling yourself about how your life was supposed to look. There is a kind of sadness that does not always speak loudly, but it lingers beneath the surface. A feeling that something did not turn out the way it should have. That life has taken a different shape than the one you once held so clearly in your mind. And this feeling carries a weight that is difficult to explain, because it is not just about what happened, it is about what never happened. There was a version of life you believed in, a path that made sense, a sequence of events that felt right, and somewhere along the way, that version began to fade. Not suddenly, but gradually, through missed chances, unexpected changes, things that did not align, things that could not be controlled. And even if you have continued moving forward, something inside may still be holding on to that earlier vision, comparing what is to what was imagined, measuring the present against a past expectation. This is where attachment quietly forms. It is not always obvious because it does not look like clinging to an object. It looks like holding on to an idea, a belief about how life should have unfolded, and this idea becomes a silent reference point that shapes how everything is experienced. When reality does not match that idea, there is discomfort. Not just because things are different, but because they are different from what you believed they should be. This creates a subtle but persistent tension, a feeling that something is off, that something is missing, even when there may be things in your life that are working, that are meaningful, that are real. The attachment to the life you thought you were supposed to have can make it difficult to fully experience the life you are actually living. Because part of your attention is always looking back, always comparing, always wondering what it would have been like if things had gone differently. This comparison creates a kind of emotional distance. You are here, but not fully here. You are living, but not fully present. Because a part of you is still connected to something that no longer exists outside of thought. There is also a deeper layer to this attachment. Because the imagined life was not just about external events, it was connected to identity, to who you believed you would become, to the roles you expected to play, to the version of yourself that felt aligned with that path. And when that life does not happen, it can feel like losing a part of yourself, not physically, but psychologically. There is a quiet grief that comes with this, a mourning for something that was never fully real, but felt real enough to shape your expectations, your hopes, your sense of direction. This grief is often overlooked because it does not have a clear object. There is no single event to point to. It is spread across time, across choices, across circumstances that did not align. And because of that, it can remain unprocessed. It can stay beneath the surface, influencing how you see your life without being fully acknowledged. Buddhist teachings bring attention to this kind of attachment, not to remove desire or intention, but to reveal the suffering that comes from holding too tightly to a specific vision. When the mind is attached to how things should be, it resists how things are. And this resistance creates a gap between reality and expectation. And it is within this gap that suffering grows. Letting go of this attachment does not mean forgetting your dreams or dismissing your past hopes. It means recognizing that those hopes were part of a process, not a fixed outcome. It means allowing them to exist without letting them define your relationship with the present. There is a difference between remembering what you once wanted and being bound by it. When you are bound by it, every deviation from that path feels like a loss. Every difference feels like a failure. But when you can hold it lightly, it becomes part of your story, not the standard by which everything is judged. This shift requires a kind of honesty. Willingness to see how much of your dissatisfaction may not come from your current situation, but from the comparison to what you thought it would be. It requires looking at the present without the constant overlay of the past, without the need to measure it against an imagined version. This is not easy, because the mind is used to referencing what it knows, to creating continuity through comparison. But slowly, this pattern can be softened by noticing when it happens, by recognizing the moment when the thought appears that things should be different, and instead of following that thought, allowing it to pass. There is also a kind of compassion that becomes important here, because attachment to a certain life often comes from a place of hope, from a desire for things to be meaningful, to be fulfilling, to be aligned with what you believed was right for you. There is nothing wrong with that desire, but when it becomes rigid, when it does not allow for change, it turns into a source of suffering. Being gentle with this process is important, not forcing yourself to let go, not criticizing yourself for holding on, but understanding that this attachment developed over time, and it will also loosen over time. As this happens, something begins to open. A space where the present moment can be experienced more fully, without the constant need to compare it to something else, without the pressure to make it match a specific vision. This does not mean everything suddenly feels perfect, but it does mean there is less internal conflict, less tension between what is and what was expected. There is also a shift in how you see your current life. Things that were previously overlooked may become more visible. Moments that were dismissed because they did not match your expectations may begin to hold more meaning. There is a richness in the present that is often missed when attention is focused on what is not there. Letting go of attachment allows that richness to be seen. There is also a deeper sense of freedom that comes with this. Because when you are no longer tied to a specific version of how life should be, there is more openness to what life actually is, more flexibility, more willingness to move in directions that were not originally planned. This does not mean losing direction. It means allowing direction to evolve, to respond to what is happening rather than being fixed in what was imagined. There is also a quiet strength in this, because it takes courage to release something that felt important, to allow a vision to change, to accept that life has taken a different shape. But within that acceptance, there is a kind of resilience, a capacity to adapt, to continue moving forward without being held back by what did not happen. Over time, the attachment begins to fade, not because it is forced away, but because it is seen clearly, recognized for what it is, an idea, a possibility that was once held. But not the only way life could unfold. This recognition creates space for new experiences, for new directions, for a different kind of fulfillment that is not based on matching a past expectation. There is also a deeper trust that can develop, a trust that life is not limited to a single path, that even if one version did not happen, others are still possible, not in the same way, not necessarily in the way you once imagined, but in ways that can still be meaningful, still be real, still be lived. This trust does not erase the past. It does not deny the disappointment, but it changes how it is held. It becomes part of the journey, not something that defines the present. As this understanding settles, there is less need to look back, less need to compare. More attention naturally returns to what is here, to what is possible now, to what can be experienced without the filter of what should have been. And in that return, there is a kind of peace. Not because everything is exactly as you once wanted, but because the struggle between expectation and reality has softened, because you are no longer fighting the difference. You are allowing it. And in that allowing, something shifts. Life becomes less about matching a plan and more about experiencing what unfolds, less about holding on to a fixed idea and more about being open to change, less about what was supposed to happen and more about what is happening now. And from this place, something new can begin. Not built on past expectations, but shaped by present awareness. Not limited by a single vision, but open to many possibilities. And in that openness, there is a quiet sense of freedom, a release from the need to hold life in a certain form, a willingness to let it move, to let it change, to let it be. And within that willingness, there is a deeper connection to life itself, not as something to control or define, but as something to experience, moment by moment, without the weight of what was supposed to be. And as that attachment to what was supposed to be begins to loosen, something else quietly takes its place, something that often feels uncomfortable at first, something the mind quickly tries to escape, the feeling of not knowing, the sense that the path is no longer clear. That direction has softened, that certainty has disappeared. There is a moment in life where the old no longer fits and the new has not yet formed. And in that space, confusion appears, not as a loud storm, but as a quiet fog that makes everything feel uncertain, undefined, difficult to grasp. And the mind does not like this. It wants clarity, it wants direction, it wants something solid to hold on to, and when it does not find it, it begins to question everything, to doubt, to search, to push for answers that are not ready to be seen. But what if this confusion is not a mistake? What if this is part of the transition itself? There is a tendency to see confusion as a sign that something is wrong, that something has gone off track, that clarity has been lost and needs to be regained as quickly as possible. But not all confusion comes from error. Some confusion comes from transformation. It appears when the mind is no longer operating within familiar patterns, when old ways of seeing no longer apply, when new understanding is still forming but not yet clear. This creates a space where things feel uncertain, not because they are broken, but because they are changing. And in that change, there is a temporary lack of structure. The mind often reacts by trying to rebuild that structure immediately, by searching for clear answers, by asking, what should I do next? Where is this going? How do I fix this feeling? But this reaction can interrupt the process that is unfolding, because confusion, when allowed, has its own movement. It is not static. It shifts. It evolves. It slowly gives way to insight, but only when it is not forced into premature clarity. There is a kind of patience required here, not passive waiting, but an active willingness to stay present with not knowing, to observe without rushing to conclusions, to allow the mind to rest, even when it does not have all the answers. This is not easy, because not knowing can feel like losing control, like being unprepared, like being exposed. But this discomfort is part of the transition. It is the space between what was and what will be, and trying to escape it too quickly can lead back into old patterns, into familiar ways of thinking that may no longer serve. There is also a deeper layer to this confusion. Because when clarity is lost, identity can feel uncertain. If you no longer know exactly who you are in the way you once did, if the roles you held have shifted, if the direction you followed is no longer clear, there is a sense of groundlessness, and this can feel unsettling. But it is also an opening. Because identity that is too fixed can limit growth. It can keep you within certain boundaries that no longer reflect who you are becoming. Confusion loosens those boundaries. It creates space for something new to emerge, something that is not defined by past expectations or fixed roles. There is also a quiet intelligence within confusion. It shows you where certainty was assumed. It reveals where control was held too tightly. It brings attention to the areas of life that are still forming. And in doing so, it invites a different kind of awareness, one that is not based on knowing, but on observing. One that is not focused on outcomes, but on presence. Buddhist teachings often speak about the value of not knowing, not as a lack, but as a state of openness. A state where the mind is not closed by fixed ideas, where it is receptive, flexible, able to see things as they are without immediately categorizing them. This openness is essential for transformation. Because new understanding cannot fully arise in a mind that is already certain, it requires space. And confusion creates that space. There is also a shift in how time is experienced during this phase. When things are clear, time often feels directed, moving toward a goal. But in confusion, time can feel slower, less defined, less structured. This can be uncomfortable at first because it feels like progress has stopped. But in reality, a different kind of movement is happening. One that is not always visible. One that is internal. This internal movement is not measured by external results. It is measured by changes in perception, in awareness, in understanding. And these changes often take time. They do not follow a strict schedule. They unfold gradually. Trying to rush them can create more confusion, not less. Because the mind may settle for answers that feel certain but are not fully aligned. Allowing confusion to exist without forcing it to resolve creates a more stable foundation for clarity when it does emerge. There is also a deep emotional aspect to this phase. Confusion can bring up feelings of insecurity, of doubt, of questioning whether you are on the right path. These feelings can be intense because they challenge the sense of direction that once felt stable. But these emotions are not signs that something is wrong. They are part of the process of letting go of what no longer fits. They are part of the transition from one way of being to another. Holding space for these emotions without immediately trying to fix them allows them to move, to rise and fall naturally, without becoming something permanent. There is also a subtle shift in trust that begins to develop. Not trust in specific outcomes, but trust in the process itself. Trust that even without clear direction, something is unfolding. That not knowing does not mean being lost. It means being in between. This trust grows slowly. It is not something that can be forced. It develops through experience, through staying present with uncertainty and seeing that clarity eventually comes. Not always in the way expected, but in a way that makes sense when it arrives. There is also a kind of humility that comes with confusion, a recognition that not everything can be understood immediately, that life is more complex than the mind can always grasp. This humility softens the need to control. It opens the mind to learning, to observing, to being with what is without needing to define it right away. This creates a different kind of intelligence, one that is not based on having answers, but on being open to what is still unfolding. Over time, the relationship with confusion begins to change. It is no longer seen as something to avoid. It becomes something that can be explored, something that can be moved through with awareness. This does not mean it becomes comfortable, but it becomes less threatening, less overwhelming, more understandable. And in this understanding there is less resistance, less need to escape, more willingness to stay, to observe, to allow. There is also a deeper connection to the present moment that develops here, because without clear direction pulling attention forward, there is more awareness of what is happening now, of thoughts, of feelings, of subtle changes in perception. This awareness creates a sense of grounding, even when the future is unclear, even when direction is not fully formed. And from this grounding, something begins to shift. Clarity starts to appear, not all at once, but gradually, in small insights, in moments of understanding, in a sense of direction that feels natural rather than forced. This clarity is different from the kind that comes from planning. It is not rigid, it is flexible. It allows for change. It is aligned with what is actually unfolding rather than what was expected. And because it arises from awareness rather than control, it carries a different kind of stability. A stability that does not collapse when things change. As this becomes more familiar, confusion is no longer seen as a failure. It is recognized as a transition, a phase where something is ending and something new is beginning, even if the beginning is not yet visible. This recognition reduces the fear associated with not knowing. It allows for a more peaceful experience of uncertainty, a more grounded way of moving through change. And in this way, confusion becomes part of the path, not something separate from it, not something to fix, but something to move through with awareness, with patience, with trust. And from this movement, something deeper emerges, a way of relating to life that is not dependent on constant clarity, a way of being that can hold uncertainty without collapsing, a quiet steadiness that remains even when things are not fully understood. And within that steadiness, there is a different kind of peace, not the peace of knowing everything, but the peace of not needing to know everything right away. A peace that allows life to unfold, without forcing it, without rushing it, without turning confusion into something wrong. And from that place, the path continues, not clearly marked, not fully defined, but alive, moving, unfolding, and you move with it, not by controlling it, but by being present within it, step by step, moment by moment, allowing the transition to complete itself naturally. And as that quiet steadiness begins to form within the uncertainty, another pattern slowly reveals itself, something that often hides behind good intentions, something that feels productive on the surface but quietly drains. Everything underneath, the constant urge to fix what is not settled, to repair what feels uncomfortable, to immediately correct anything that does not feel right. There is a kind of restlessness that does not come from confusion anymore, but from the need to escape it, a subtle pressure to always be doing something about what is happening, to always be improving, adjusting, solving, making sure nothing remains unresolved for too long. At first, it feels responsible. It feels like strength. It feels like taking control of your life. But over time, something begins to wear down. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but quietly, slowly, almost unnoticed, until it becomes too heavy to ignore. There is a fatigue that builds when everything becomes a problem to solve, when every emotion needs to be managed, when every situation needs to be improved, when every moment that feels uncomfortable is treated as something that must be fixed immediately. This is the exhaustion that does not come from doing too much physically, but from trying to control too much internally. The mind becomes busy, constantly scanning for what is wrong, constantly evaluating, constantly trying to bring everything into a state that feels acceptable. And in doing so, it never truly rests. Even when nothing urgent is happening, there is still a background activity, a subtle tension, a sense that something needs attention, something needs to be adjusted, something is not quite right. This creates a state where peace is always conditional, where rest only feels allowed when everything is resolved. And since everything is rarely resolved all at once, rest becomes rare. There is also a deeper layer to this pattern, because the need to fix everything is often connected to a belief that things should not be the way they are. That discomfort is a mistake, that uncertainty is a problem, that emotional pain is something to be removed as quickly as possible, and this belief drives the constant effort. It creates a cycle where the more discomfort appears, the more the mind tries to fix it, and the more it tries to fix it, the more attention is placed on what is wrong. This attention amplifies the experience. It keeps the focus on the problem rather than allowing space for it to move naturally. There is also a subtle form of control hidden in this behavior, a belief that if everything is managed properly, then nothing will go wrong. That if every detail is handled, every emotion processed, every situation improved, then life will finally feel stable. But this control is never complete. There is always something new to address, something else that needs attention, and so the effort continues, without end. This creates a kind of inner pressure that is difficult to maintain, because the mind is always engaged, always working, always trying to stay ahead of what might go wrong, and over time this leads to exhaustion. Not just mental exhaustion, but emotional and even physical. There is a sense of being drained, of having less energy for things that once felt simple, of feeling overwhelmed not by one big problem, but by the constant need to manage everything. This is the spiritual exhaustion that comes from trying to fix life instead of allowing it. It is not about giving up responsibility. It is about recognizing the difference between what needs action and what needs acceptance. Because not everything requires fixing. Some things require space. Some things require time. Some things require simply being experienced without interference. Buddhist teachings point to this distinction. They show that suffering increases when there is resistance to what is, when there is a constant effort to change what is already happening. And they also show that relief begins when that resistance softens, when the need to fix everything is replaced with the ability to observe, to be present, to allow. This does not mean ignoring problems. It means responding to them from a place of clarity rather than urgency. It means acting where action is needed, but not turning every experience into something that must be controlled. There is a kind of freedom in this shift, because when the need to fix everything is released, even slightly, there is more space, more room to breathe, more room to simply be without the constant pressure to improve or correct. This space creates a different kind of energy, not driven by stress, but by presence, not fueled by fear, but by awareness. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form, that not all discomfort is harmful, that some emotions are meant to be felt, not fixed, that some situations are meant to unfold, not be forced into resolution. This understanding changes the relationship with experience. It reduces the need to immediately act. It allows for a pause, a moment where the situation can be seen clearly before responding. And in that pause, something important happens. The intensity begins to soften, the urgency begins to fade. The situation no longer feels like something that must be handled immediately. It becomes something that can be approached with more calm, more clarity, more balance. There is also a shift in how emotions are experienced. Instead of being seen as problems to solve, they are seen as signals, as expressions of what is happening internally, and when they are allowed to move without being fixed, they often change on their own. They rise, they fall, they pass, without needing to be controlled. This reduces the emotional strain. It creates a more fluid experience, where feelings are not held tightly but allowed to move naturally. There is also a deeper sense of trust that develops, a trust that not everything needs to be managed for things to be okay, that life can continue, that things can unfold, even without constant intervention. This trust is not immediate. It grows over time, through repeated experiences of letting go of control and seeing that things do not fall apart, that situations resolve in their own way. That clarity emerges without being forced. There is also a kind of simplicity that returns when the need to fix everything is reduced. Life becomes less complicated, less crowded with constant analysis, more direct, more present. Attention is no longer divided between what is happening and what needs to be fixed. It becomes focused on what is actually here. This focus creates a sense of grounding, a feeling of being connected to the moment rather than constantly trying to change it. And in that grounding, there is a different kind of peace. Not the peace of everything being perfect, but the peace of not needing everything to be perfect. This peace is more stable, more consistent, because it does not depend on constant effort. It exists even when things are not fully resolved. Over time, the habit of fixing begins to soften, not because it is forced to stop, but because it is seen clearly, recognized as unnecessary in many moments. And in that recognition, it naturally loses its intensity. There is less urgency, less pressure, more ease. There is also a deeper connection to yourself that begins to form. Because when the mind is not constantly trying to fix everything, it becomes quieter, more receptive, more aware of subtle thoughts, feelings, sensations. This awareness creates a deeper understanding of what is actually needed. Not what the mind assumes is needed, but what is truly required in the moment. And often, what is needed is not action but presence, not fixing but allowing, not controlling but trusting. This shift changes everything, because it moves life from a state of constant effort to a state of balanced response, from exhaustion to steadiness, from tension to ease. And in that change, there is a kind of renewal, a return of energy, a sense of lightness that was not possible when everything had to be managed. Life begins to feel less like a problem to solve and more like something to experience, something to move with, something to allow. And from that place, action still happens. Decisions are still made, but they are no longer driven by the need to fix everything. They are guided by awareness, by clarity, by a deeper understanding of what truly matters. This is where surrender deepens again, not as giving up, but as releasing unnecessary effort, as trusting that not everything needs to be handled immediately, as allowing life to unfold without constant interference. And in that surrender, something powerful happens. The exhaustion begins to fade. The mind begins to rest. The heart feels lighter. And life, even in its imperfections, begins to feel more manageable, more open, more alive, because it is no longer being forced into a shape it was never meant to hold. And as that constant effort to fix everything begins to fall away, a deeper truth starts to surface. Something that feels far more personal than plans or outcomes, something that touches the very way you see yourself, the identity you have carried for so long, the version of you that felt solid, certain, defined. There is a moment in life when things begin to crack, not just around you, but within you, when the roles you held no longer feel stable, when the image you had of yourself starts to shift, when what once felt like who you are begins to feel uncertain. And this can feel unsettling. Because identity gives a sense of control. It creates a structure, a way to understand yourself, a way to move through the world with direction. But sometimes that structure cannot hold peace. Sometimes it is built on pressure, on expectations, on the need to prove something, on the need to be a certain way. And when that happens, life begins to challenge it, not gently but in ways that feel disruptive. Plans fall apart, situations change, things stop working the way they used to, and it can feel like everything is breaking. But what is actually being broken is not life itself. It is the identity that could not carry what you truly need. There is a version of you that was shaped by past experiences, by beliefs, by what you thought you had to be in order to succeed, to be accepted, to feel secure. This version may have worked for a time. It may have helped you move forward. But over time, it can become rigid. It can become something that demands constant effort to maintain. Something that creates tension instead of ease, something that holds you in a certain form that no longer fits. And life, in its own way, begins to respond. Not as punishment, not as something going wrong, but as a correction, a movement towards something more aligned. But this movement often feels like loss, because the identity that is being challenged feels familiar. It feels safe. Even if it is not peaceful, letting it go can feel like losing a part of yourself, like stepping into something unknown. And the mind resists this. It tries to hold on to what it knows, to rebuild what is breaking, to return to what felt certain. But this resistance creates more suffering, because what is being broken is no longer sustainable. It cannot carry the weight of your growth. It cannot support the deeper peace that is trying to emerge. There is a difference between an identity that is functional and one that is aligned. A functional identity helps you operate in the world. It allows you to perform roles, to meet expectations, to achieve goals. But an aligned identity is different. It is not built on pressure. It is not driven by fear. It is rooted in awareness, in presence, in a deeper understanding of who you are beyond roles and expectations. When life begins to break the functional identity, it is often because it is making space for the aligned one. But this transition is not smooth. It involves uncertainty. It involves letting go of familiar patterns. It involves facing parts of yourself that were hidden beneath the structure of who you thought you were. This can feel uncomfortable because it removes the sense of control. It removes the clear definition. It leaves you in a space where you are not fully who you were, but not yet who you are becoming. And in that space, there is vulnerability. But there is also possibility. Because without the old identity holding everything in place, there is room for something new to emerge, something that is not forced, something that is not shaped by external expectations, something that reflects a deeper truth. There is also a release that begins to happen when the old identity loosens. A release from the need to constantly maintain an image, to meet certain standards, to prove something. This release can feel like relief, even if it is mixed with uncertainty. Because the effort that was once required to hold everything together is no longer needed in the same way. There is more space, more freedom, more room to simply be. There is also a shift in how you relate to yourself. Because when identity is not fixed, there is less judgment, less need to fit into a specific definition, more openness to change, more acceptance of different aspects of yourself. This creates a softer internal environment, one that is not constantly evaluating or comparing, one that allows for growth without pressure. Buddhist teachings point to the idea that the self is not fixed, that identity is not something permanent. It is something that changes, that evolves, that is influenced by conditions. And when this is understood, there is less attachment to any single version of yourself. There is more flexibility, more ease with change. This does not mean losing a sense of self. It means not being confined by it. It means allowing it to shift as life unfolds. There is also a deeper sense of peace that becomes possible when identity is not rigid. Because peace does not come from maintaining a certain image, it comes from being aligned with what is, from not resisting change, from not needing to control how you are seen or how things should be. When identity is flexible, there is less conflict, less tension between who you are and what is happening. There is more harmony, more flow, more acceptance. This does not mean everything becomes easy. Challenges still arise, but they are not experienced as threats to identity. They are seen as part of the process, as opportunities to learn, to grow, to understand. This creates a different kind of resilience, one that is not based on holding everything together, but on being able to move through change without losing balance. There is also a deeper connection to the present moment that develops when identity is not fixed, because attention is no longer focused on maintaining a certain image or reaching a certain version of yourself. It becomes available for what is happening now, for the experience of life as it is, and in that experience there is a kind of richness, a depth that is not dependent on achieving something, but on being fully present. Over time, the breaking of the old identity begins to feel less like a loss and more like a transformation, a shift from something that was limited to something that is more open, more aligned, more capable of holding peace. This transformation is not immediate. It unfolds gradually, through moments of awareness, through experiences that challenge old patterns, through a growing understanding of what truly matters. And as it unfolds, there is a sense of coming into something more real, something that does not need to be forced, something that feels natural. There is also a deeper trust that develops in this process, a trust that even when things are breaking, something is being created, that even when identity feels uncertain, something more stable is forming. This trust reduces fear. It allows for a more relaxed approach to change, a willingness to move with it rather than resist it. And in that willingness, there is less suffering, less need to hold on to what is no longer working, more openness to what is emerging. This openness creates a different way of living, one that is not defined by a fixed identity, but by awareness, by presence, by the ability to respond to life as it unfolds. And in this way, the breaking of identity becomes part of the path, not something to avoid, but something to move through, something that clears the way for a deeper kind of peace, a peace that is not dependent on who you think you are, but on your ability to be with what is, without resistance, without the need to control, without the pressure to maintain a certain form. And from this place, something changes. Life no longer feels like something that must be managed through identity. It becomes something that can be experienced directly, without the filter of who you think you should be, without the weight of expectations, without the need to hold everything together. And in that experience, there is a kind of freedom, a release from the structures that once defined you, a movement into something more fluid, more open, more aligned. And within that alignment, there is peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer trying to be something that cannot carry it. You are allowing yourself to become something that can. And as that old identity begins to fall away and something quieter starts to take its place, there is a moment that often goes unspoken, a moment that feels wide and unfamiliar, a space that opens where something once stood. And in that space, a feeling rises that can be difficult to face. There is a kind of silence that appears when the old life no longer holds, when the patterns that once gave direction begin to fade, when the roles you carried start to loosen, and suddenly there is more space than you expected, more openness than you are used to. And instead of feeling peaceful, that space can feel unsettling. There is a subtle fear that begins to form, not because something is actively wrong, but because something is no longer there, something that once filled your time, your thoughts, your sense of identity. This is the fear of emptiness. It does not always come as panic. Sometimes it comes as restlessness, as a need to fill the space quickly, as a discomfort with stillness, as a quiet urge to return to something familiar, even if it was not truly fulfilling. Because the mind is not used to open space, it is used to structure, to movement, to having something to hold on to, and when that structure disappears, it feels exposed. There is a sense of not knowing what to do with yourself, of not having a clear direction, of being in between, and this in between can feel like a void. But the fear is not coming from the emptiness itself. It is coming from the interpretation of it, from the belief that emptiness means loss, that it means something is missing, that it must be filled as soon as possible. But emptiness, in a deeper sense, is not absence. It is openness. It is space that is no longer occupied by what no longer fits. It is room for something new to emerge. But this is not immediately obvious, because the mind is focused on what is no longer there, on what has ended, on what has been removed. And this focus creates a sense of lack, a feeling that something important is gone. There is also a deeper emotional layer here, because the old life, even if it was not fully aligned, provided a sense of familiarity. It created routines. It gave a sense of knowing what comes next. And when that is gone, there is a loss of predictability, a loss of certainty. And this can feel like losing ground, like stepping into something without a clear path. This is where fear begins to grow, not because the space itself is dangerous, but because it is unknown. And the mind often associates the unknown with risk, with instability, with something to be avoided, so it tries to escape. It looks for ways to fill the space, to create new plans, to rebuild structure quickly, to return to something that feels stable. But rushing to fill emptiness can prevent something important from happening, because that space is not empty in the way it seems. It is full of potential, full of possibilities that cannot appear when everything is already defined. There is a kind of richness in emptiness that is not immediately visible because it does not present itself as something concrete. It does not offer clear answers. It does not provide instant direction, but it holds the conditions for something new to form, something that is not shaped by old patterns, something that is not driven by past expectations. Allowing this space to exist without rushing to fill it requires a different kind of courage. Not the courage to act, but the courage to stay, to remain present in the openness, to sit with the discomfort without immediately trying to change it. This is not easy, because the urge to fill the space can be strong. It can feel like doing nothing is a mistake, like time is being wasted, like something important is being missed. But this perception comes from the habit of constant movement, from the belief that value is only found in action, in progress, in visible change. Emptiness challenges that belief. It asks you to be without needing to become something immediately, to exist without a defined role, to experience life without a clear structure. And in that experience, something shifts. At first, the space may feel uncomfortable, but over time, as the mind becomes more familiar with it, it begins to soften. The restlessness begins to decrease. The need to fill the space begins to fade, and in its place there is a quiet calm, a sense of ease that does not come from having everything figured out, but from not needing to. There is also a deeper awareness that begins to develop in this space, because without constant activity, without constant distraction, there is more attention available, more sensitivity to what is happening internally, more clarity about thoughts, emotions, patterns. This awareness creates insight, not forced, not analyzed, but naturally arising. There is also a kind of healing that happens in emptiness, because the mind is no longer occupied with maintaining old patterns. It has space to process, to settle, to release what has been held. This healing is not always visible, but it is real. It happens quietly, in the background, without needing to be directed. There is also a shift in how you relate to yourself, because without a fixed identity or structure, there is less pressure to be a certain way, more freedom to explore, to notice, to understand. This creates a deeper connection, not based on roles or expectations, but on awareness, on presence, on being. There is also a transformation in how you see emptiness itself. It no longer feels like something to avoid. It begins to feel like something valuable, a space where life can unfold without interference, where clarity can arise without being forced, where new directions can form naturally. This transformation does not happen instantly. It develops gradually, through staying with the experience, through allowing the space to exist, through not rushing to escape it. Over time, the fear begins to lose its intensity, not because the unknown becomes known, but because the relationship with the unknown changes. It becomes less threatening, less overwhelming, more neutral, more open. There is also a deeper trust that begins to grow, a trust that this space is not a dead end, that it is not a sign of failure, but part of a process, a necessary phase where something is being cleared, something is being prepared. This trust allows you to remain present without needing immediate answers, without needing to define the next step right away. And in that presence, something begins to emerge, not all at once, not in a clear and structured way, but gradually, in small movements, in subtle shifts, in a sense of direction that feels natural rather than forced. This emergence is different from what was planned before. It is not based on old expectations. It is shaped by what is now possible, by what is aligned with the present moment. And because it arises from emptiness, it carries a different quality. It is less rigid, less pressured, more fluid, more responsive to change. As this becomes more familiar, emptiness is no longer something to fear. It becomes something to trust, a space where life reorganizes itself, where new possibilities take shape, where deeper awareness develops. And in that trust, there is a sense of peace, not because everything is filled, but because the need to fill everything has softened, because the space itself is no longer seen as a problem, but as part of the path, part of the unfolding, part of the process of letting go and beginning again. And from this place, something changes. Life no longer feels like something that must always be full, always defined, always certain. It becomes something that can include space, include openness, include moments where nothing is fully formed. And in those moments, there is a different kind of richness, a quiet depth, a sense of being that does not depend on constant activity. And within that depth, there is a new kind of stability, one that does not rely on structure, but on presence, on awareness, on the ability to be with what is, even when it feels empty. And from that stability, the next phase begins, not forced, not rushed, but naturally, as life continues to unfold, carrying you forward, even through the space that once felt like nothing. And as that space of emptiness slowly becomes less threatening and more alive, something else quietly reveals itself, a belief that has been guiding so many decisions without being questioned. The idea that before you can trust life, you must first understand it. That before you can move forward, everything must make sense. There is a subtle waiting that happens inside, a quiet pause that stretches longer than it needs to, because the mind keeps saying not yet, not until things are clearer, not until the path is fully visible, not until you feel certain. And so you wait. You wait for answers, you wait for signs, you wait for the moment when everything finally clicks into place. But that moment rarely comes in the way you expect, because clarity is not always the starting point, it is often the result. There is a deep habit in the mind to believe that understanding must come first, that trust is something earned only after everything has been explained, mapped out, secured. But life does not move that way. It unfolds step by step, often without revealing the full picture, often asking for movement before certainty appears. And this creates a tension because part of you wants to move, to take the next step, to continue unfolding. And another part holds back, waiting for clarity, waiting for reassurance, waiting for something solid to remove all doubt. This tension can keep you stuck in a quiet loop, thinking, analyzing, questioning, trying to figure everything out before acting. And while this may feel like caution, it often becomes a form of delay, not because you are incapable, but because the condition you are waiting for may never fully arrive. Clarity is not always something that appears before action. It is often something that grows through action, through movement, through experience, through being in the process rather than standing outside of it, trying to understand it completely. The fantasy that clarity must come first creates a kind of paralysis, because the mind is trying to solve something that cannot be fully solved in advance. It is trying to predict outcomes that depend on factors that are not yet present. It is trying to control uncertainty by turning it into certainty before anything has actually happened. And this effort becomes exhausting because no amount of thinking can fully remove the unknown. There will always be variables. There will always be aspects of life that cannot be predicted, and when the mind insists on full clarity before trust, it creates a condition that is almost impossible to meet. So trust is delayed, movement is postponed, life is placed on hold. There is also a deeper emotional layer to this, because the need for clarity is often connected to fear. Fear of making the wrong decision, fear of failing, fear of stepping into something that might not work out. And clarity feels like protection. It feels like a way to reduce risk, to ensure that everything will be okay. But this protection is not complete, because even with clarity, outcomes cannot be guaranteed. Even with understanding, life can still change. And so the search for clarity becomes endless, always just one more answer away, always just one more piece of information needed, but never fully satisfied. Buddhist teachings offer a different way of seeing this. They suggest that trust does not come from knowing everything. It comes from being willing to move without knowing everything, from accepting that uncertainty is part of the path, not something to be removed, but something to be included. This kind of trust is not blind, it is grounded in presence, in the ability to respond to what is happening now rather than trying to control what might happen later. There is a shift that begins to happen when this is understood. The focus moves away from needing to understand everything in advance and toward being fully engaged with the present moment. Instead of asking what will happen, the question becomes, what is needed now? What is the next step that can be taken, even without full clarity? This shift reduces the pressure, because the mind no longer has to hold the entire future at once. It only needs to be present with what is here. And from that presence, decisions can arise more naturally, more intuitively, more aligned with what is actually happening. There is also a release that happens when the need for clarity softens, a letting go of the constant search, a relaxation of the mind, because it no longer has to solve everything before moving. It can rest in not knowing and still move forward. This creates a different kind of energy, less driven by fear, more guided by awareness. There is also a deeper sense of flow that begins to appear, because when you are not waiting for perfect clarity, you are more open to opportunities as they arise, more responsive to change, more flexible in how you move. Life becomes less rigid, less controlled, more dynamic. This does not mean acting without thought. It means acting without needing absolute certainty. It means being willing to take steps even when the full path is not visible. There is also a transformation in how mistakes are perceived, because when clarity is not a requirement, mistakes are no longer seen as failures of understanding. They become part of the process, part of how clarity develops. This reduces fear. It allows for experimentation, for learning through experience, rather than trying to avoid all possible errors in advance. Over time, this changes the relationship with uncertainty. It is no longer something that blocks movement. It becomes something that accompanies it, something that is present but not limiting. There is also a deeper trust in yourself that begins to form, a recognition that even without full clarity, you are capable of responding, of adjusting, of navigating whatever arises. This trust is built through experience, through moving forward despite uncertainty and seeing that you can handle what comes. And each time this happens, the need for clarity before trust becomes less strong. There is also a shift in how time is experienced. Because when you are not waiting for clarity, there is less delay, less hesitation, more engagement with the present. This creates a sense of momentum, not forced, but natural. A movement that comes from being involved rather than standing back. There is also a deeper connection to life itself. Because when you are not trying to fully understand everything before engaging, you are more present, more open, more aware of what is actually happening. And in that awareness, there is a richness, a depth that is not available when the mind is focused only on figuring things out. As this becomes more familiar, the need for clarity begins to fade, not completely, but enough to allow trust to emerge. Trust that does not depend on having all the answers. Trust that exists even when things are not fully understood. This trust is quiet. It does not announce itself. It shows up as a willingness to move, to take the next step, to continue unfolding, even when the path is not fully clear. And in that willingness, something shifts. Life begins to feel less like a puzzle to solve and more like something to experience, something to move through, something that reveals itself over time, not all at once, but gradually. As you stay present, as you continue, as you allow clarity to arise from the process rather than demanding it before the process begins. And from this place, something new becomes possible, a way of living that is not dependent on certainty, a way of moving that is not blocked by not knowing, a way of trusting that does not require full understanding. And in that way of living, there is a kind of freedom, a release from the need to have everything figured out, a return to the present moment where life is actually happening, where decisions can be made, where movement can occur, where trust can exist, even in the absence of clarity. And in that trust, something deeper unfolds. A connection to life that is not based on control, but on participation, on being part of the process, on allowing things to reveal themselves in their own time. And within that unfolding, there is peace. Not because everything is known, but because not everything needs to be known for life to continue, for you to move, for you to trust. And that realization changes everything. And as that quiet trust begins to grow, even without full clarity, another confusion often rises, something that feels similar on the surface, but carries a very different meaning underneath. The fear that if you stop holding so tightly, if you stop pushing, if you stop forcing, then you are giving up. There is a subtle line here that many people do not see clearly, a line between surrender and defeat, between release and abandonment, between letting go and walking away from life itself. And because that line feels unclear, the mind hesitates. It asks, if I stop trying so hard, will everything fall apart? If I loosen my grip, will I lose what matters? If I accept things as they are, does that mean I no longer care? These questions create tension. They keep you holding on, even when holding on is what is causing the pain. There is a deep misunderstanding in this space, because giving up and letting go are not the same. Giving up comes from exhaustion mixed with hopelessness. It carries a sense of collapse, a feeling that nothing can be done, that effort is pointless, that there is no way forward. It is heavy, it closes things down, it disconnects you from life. Letting go is different. It does not come from hopelessness, it comes from clarity, from seeing that what you are holding onto is no longer serving you, that the effort being applied is creating more suffering than movement, that the attachment is tighter than it needs to be. Letting go is not about stopping completely, it is about releasing the struggle, releasing the need to force a specific outcome, releasing the grip that is causing tension. This difference is subtle but powerful, because from the outside, both can look like stepping back. But internally, they come from very different places. One is rooted in defeat, the other is rooted in awareness. When you give up, there is a withdrawal, a shutting down, a loss of connection to purpose, to movement, to possibility. When you let go, there is a softening, a release of pressure, a return to presence. Movement does not stop, it changes. It becomes less forced, less rigid, more aligned. There is also a difference in how energy feels in both states. Giving up drains energy. It leaves you feeling empty in a heavy way, disconnected. Still, letting go restores energy, not immediately in a dramatic way, but gradually, because the effort that was once spent on resistance is no longer needed. That energy becomes available again, for awareness, for response, for movement that is not driven by tension. There is also a difference in how the future is experienced. When you give up, the future feels closed, limited. There is little expectation of change. When you let go, the future remains open, not controlled, not fully known, but still possible, still unfolding, still alive. This openness is important because it allows new directions to appear, directions that could not be seen while you were holding tightly to a specific outcome. There is also a shift in how you relate to what you are releasing. Giving up often carries regret, a sense that something was lost, that something should have worked but did not. Letting go carries understanding, a recognition that what was being held is no longer aligned, that continuing to hold it would create more suffering. That release is not failure, it is adjustment, it is realignment. There is also a deeper emotional clarity in letting go, because it involves acknowledging what is true, without forcing it to be something else, without pretending, without resisting. This honesty creates a sense of peace, not because everything is perfect, but because there is no longer a fight between what is and what is wanted. Buddhist teachings often point to this distinction. They show that attachment creates suffering, not because desire itself is wrong, but because clinging to a specific outcome creates tension. And when that tension is released, there is relief, not from giving up on life, but from no longer forcing life into a specific form. Letting go does not mean you stop caring. It means you care without needing control. It means you remain engaged without being attached to a specific result. It means you continue moving without carrying the weight of expectation. There is also a deeper sense of trust in letting go, a trust that life can unfold without being tightly managed, that things can move without being forced, that outcomes can shift without everything falling apart. This trust is not blind. It is built through experience, through seeing that when you release control, things do not collapse. They change, they adjust, they find their own direction. There is also a kind of humility in letting go, a recognition that not everything can be controlled, that not everything needs to be held, that sometimes the most skillful action is to release rather than to push. This humility softens the mind. It reduces the need to constantly prove something, to constantly achieve, to constantly maintain. It allows for a more relaxed way of being, one that is not driven by pressure, but by awareness. There is also a difference in how pain is experienced. When you give up, pain often lingers because it is mixed with resistance, with regret, with a sense of loss. When you let go, pain may still be present, but it is cleaner, less complicated, because it is not being resisted, it is being allowed, and in that allowing, it can move, it can change, it can pass. There is also a shift in how decisions are made. Giving up often leads to avoidance, to stepping away from engagement, to not wanting to try again. Letting go leads to clarity, to seeing what is needed now, to making choices that are not based on past attachment, but on present awareness. This creates a different kind of movement, one that is not reactive, but responsive, one that is not forced, but natural. There is also a deeper sense of alignment that begins to appear, because when you let go of what is not working, you create space for what does. You remove the tension that was blocking movement. You allow life to reorganize itself. And in that reorganization, there is a flow, a sense of things moving more smoothly. Not because everything is easy, but because there is less resistance, less force, less struggle. Over time, this distinction becomes clearer. Not as an idea, but as an experience. You begin to feel the difference in your body, in your mind, in your energy. You notice when you are holding too tightly, when effort turns into strain, when persistence turns into pressure. And in those moments, there is an opportunity to soften, to release, to let go. This does not mean stopping completely. It means adjusting. It means finding a different way to engage, one that does not create unnecessary suffering. There is also a deeper freedom in letting go, because you are no longer bound to a specific outcome. You are no longer limited by a fixed expectation. You are open, flexible, able to move in ways that were not previously considered. This flexibility allows for growth, for change, for new possibilities to emerge, and in that openness there is a sense of ease, a reduction in pressure, a feeling that life is not something you have to control completely, but something you can move with. There is also a deeper connection to the present moment, because when you are not holding on to a future outcome, attention returns to what is here, to what can be experienced now, to what can be responded to now. And in that presence, there is a kind of peace, not dependent on results, but on awareness, on being fully here. As this understanding settles, the fear of letting go begins to fade, because it is no longer seen as giving up. It is seen as a skill, a way of reducing suffering, a way of aligning with life, a way of moving without unnecessary weight. And from this place, something shifts. You are no longer fighting to hold everything together. You are no longer afraid to release what is not working. You are no longer trapped between effort and exhaustion. You are moving with awareness, with clarity, with a quieter kind of strength. And in that movement, there is peace. Not because everything is controlled, but because you are no longer trying to control everything. You are allowing, you are responding, you are letting go. And in that letting go, life continues, not as something to give up on, but as something to live more freely, more fully, more openly, without the weight of holding on to what no longer needs to be held. And as that quiet strength of letting go begins to take root, another hidden pattern starts to reveal itself. Something even more subtle than control or attachment, something that shapes how pain lives inside you long after the moment has passed. There is a kind of pain that was never meant to stay. It arrived as an experience, as a moment, as something that moved through your life, but somewhere along the way it stopped being just something that happened and slowly became something you began to carry as part of who you are. At first, it was simple. Something went wrong, something hurt, something did not go the way you expected, and naturally there was a reaction. Emotion rose, thoughts formed, the body felt it. This is normal. This is part of being human. Pain comes, it is felt, and if allowed, it moves. But something changes when resistance appears, when the mind begins to argue with the pain. When it says this should not have happened, this should not be here, this needs to go away. That resistance creates friction, and that friction holds the pain in place. Instead of moving through, it begins to stay. Not because it is meant to stay, but because it is being held. There is a subtle shift that happens here. The experience of pain begins to turn into a story, a narrative, a repetition of what happened and what it means. And over time, that story becomes familiar. It begins to shape how you see yourself, not just as someone who experienced pain, but as someone defined by it. This is how temporary pain becomes identity. It is not the pain itself that creates this. It is the resistance to it, the repeated focus, the constant revisiting, the way the mind holds on to it and builds around it. There is a kind of attachment that forms, even if it does not feel like attachment, because the pain becomes known. It becomes part of how you understand your life. It becomes something you return to when explaining who you are. And slowly, without noticing, it becomes part of your identity. This identity can take many forms. It can be the person who was hurt, the one who was rejected, the one who failed, the one who did not get what they deserved. These labels may not be spoken out loud, but they exist internally. They shape perception. They influence decisions. They create patterns. And once pain becomes identity, it becomes harder to release. Because letting it go no longer feels like releasing an experience. It feels like losing a part of yourself. There is also a deeper emotional layer to this, because identity creates a sense of stability. Even if that identity is based on pain, it is familiar. It provides a way to understand yourself, and the mind often prefers familiar discomfort over unfamiliar openness, so it holds on to the pain, not consciously, but through repetition, through thought, through memory, through the way it continues to relate to the past. This repetition strengthens the identity. It keeps the pain active. It prevents it from fading naturally. There is also a subtle reinforcement that happens through attention. What the mind focuses on grows, and when attention is repeatedly directed toward past pain, it remains present, not as a current experience, but as a continued mental and emotional state. This is why resistance is so powerful, because it keeps the mind engaged with what it is trying to avoid. It creates a loop. The more you resist, the more you think about it. The more you think about it, the more it feels like part of you. Breaking this loop does not come from forcing the pain away. It comes from changing the relationship with it, from allowing it to be experienced without turning it into a fixed story, without attaching it to identity. This does not mean ignoring it. It means seeing it clearly, feeling it fully, without adding layers of meaning that extend beyond the moment. There is a difference between feeling pain and becoming it. Feeling pain is direct. It is immediate. It moves. Becoming it is indirect. It is constructed. It is maintained through thought and identification. When this distinction becomes clear, something begins to shift. You start to notice when the mind is turning an experience into a story, when it is adding meaning, when it is reinforcing identity, and in that noticing there is space. Space to not follow the pattern. Space to let the experience remain what it is, temporary. There is also a release that begins to happen when resistance softens, because without resistance, pain does not need to be held. It can move, it can change, it can fade, not instantly, but naturally, without being reinforced. This release creates a different kind of lightness, not because nothing hurts, but because what hurts is not being turned into something permanent. There is also a deeper understanding that develops. That pain is part of life, but it is not the definition of life, that experiences come and go, that they do not need to be carried as identity. This understanding reduces the need to hold on to the past. It allows for a more fluid sense of self. one that is not fixed, one that can change, that can grow, that is not limited by previous experiences. There is also a shift in how you relate to yourself, because when identity is not tied to pain, there is less self-judgment, less labeling, more openness, more compassion. You are no longer seen as someone defined by what happened, but as someone who experienced it and continues to move. This creates a sense of freedom, because you are not bound to a fixed story. You are not limited by past definitions. You are open, able to evolve, able to respond differently. There is also a deeper connection to the present moment, because when the mind is not constantly referencing past pain, attention is available for what is happening now, for current experiences, for new possibilities. This presence allows for a different kind of life, one that is not shaped by what was, but by what is. Over time, the identity built around pain begins to loosen, not because it is forced to disappear, but because it is no longer reinforced. It is no longer fed by resistance. It is no longer repeated through constant attention. And in that loosening, something new emerges, a sense of self that is not defined by suffering, but by awareness, by presence, by the ability to experience without becoming attached. There is also a deeper sense of peace that becomes possible, because when pain is not turned into identity, it does not stay. It passes, it changes, it becomes part of the flow of experience, rather than something that is carried indefinitely. This peace is not the absence of pain, it is the absence of identification with pain, a subtle but powerful difference. As this becomes more familiar, the relationship with life changes. Challenges are still experienced. Difficult moments still arise, but they are not turned into permanent labels. They are not used to define who you are. They are allowed to be what they are, temporary, part of the movement of life. And in this way, resistance loses its power, because it is no longer needed to control or define experience. It is seen for what it is, a reaction that creates more suffering, and in that seeing, it begins to fade, not completely, but enough to create space for awareness, for presence, for a different way of relating to life. And in that space, something important happens. You begin to live without carrying everything that has happened to you. You begin to move without the weight of constant identification. You begin to experience without turning every moment into a story. And in that movement, there is a kind of lightness, a sense of being that is not defined by the past, but open to the present. And from that openness, life continues, not as something shaped by resistance, but as something that flows, changes, unfolds, without needing to become something you hold on to. And in that unfolding, there is freedom. Not because nothing has happened, but because what has happened is no longer who you are. And as that weight of identity built around pain begins to loosen, something else quietly challenges the way you see your path. Something that questions a belief you may not even realize you hold, the idea that growth must feel peaceful, that transformation must look calm, that anything meaningful must carry a sense of light and clarity. But life does not always look like that. There are moments that feel ordinary, messy, frustrating, even disappointing, moments that seem far from anything spiritual, moments where nothing feels meaningful, where nothing feels guided, where everything just feels like confusion, delay, or struggle. And in those moments, something inside begins to doubt. It asks, where is the meaning in this? Where is the growth? Where is the purpose? How can this possibly be part of something deeper when it feels so ordinary, so disconnected, so far from anything that resembles peace? This is where trust is tested, not when things are clear, not when things feel aligned, but when nothing about the moment suggests that anything meaningful is happening. There is a quiet expectation many people carry, that spiritual growth should feel elevated, that it should bring a sense of calm, that it should be recognizable in some way, but the deeper truth is that much of growth does not feel special while it is happening. It feels like life. Unpolished, uncertain, sometimes even disappointing. The mind struggles with this because it looks for signs. It looks for confirmation that something important is taking place. And when those signs are not obvious, it begins to question the process. It begins to doubt whether anything meaningful is unfolding at all. But this doubt comes from a narrow view of what growth looks like. Because growth is not always found in stillness or clarity. It is often found in the middle of confusion, in the repetition of ordinary moments, in the quiet endurance of things that do not feel significant at the time. There is a kind of humility required to trust life in these moments, to accept that not everything will feel profound, that not every step will feel guided, that sometimes the path is simply moving through what is in front of you without clear understanding. This humility softens the need for every moment to feel meaningful. It allows life to be experienced as it is, without needing it to match a certain idea of what it should feel like. There is also a deeper layer to this, because the need for moments to feel spiritual often comes from the desire for reassurance, for confirmation that you are on the right path, that things are unfolding as they should. And when that reassurance is not present, it creates uncertainty. But relying on external or emotional signs to confirm the path can become limiting, because it ties trust to feeling. And feelings change, they rise and fall. They are influenced by many factors. They are not always reliable indicators of what is truly happening. Trust that depends on feeling will always be unstable, because when the feeling fades, the trust fades with it. But trust that is grounded in awareness is different. It does not depend on how the moment feels. It depends on the understanding that life is unfolding, even when it does not feel like it. That growth is happening, even when it is not visible. That meaning exists, even when it is not immediately clear. This kind of trust is quieter, less dramatic. It does not need constant confirmation. It remains even in ordinary moments, even in difficult ones. There is also a shift in how you begin to see these moments. Instead of viewing them as empty or unimportant, you start to recognize them as part of the process, as necessary steps that may not feel significant on their own, but contribute to something larger. This does not mean forcing meaning onto every situation. It means being open to the possibility that meaning may not always be obvious in the moment. There is also a deeper presence that begins to develop when you stop needing every moment to feel spiritual, because attention is no longer focused on evaluating the experience, on deciding whether it is meaningful or not. It becomes available for simply being in the moment, for experiencing what is actually happening. This presence creates a different kind of connection, one that is not based on interpretation, but on direct experience. There is also a reduction in resistance, because when you are not expecting every moment to feel a certain way, there is less disappointment when it does not, less frustration, less questioning, more acceptance of what is. This acceptance does not mean passivity. It means engaging with life as it is, rather than as you think it should be. There is also a deeper resilience that develops here, because you are no longer dependent on external signs to maintain trust. You are able to stay grounded even when things feel unclear, even when they feel ordinary, even when they feel difficult. This resilience creates stability, a sense that you can continue moving forward without needing constant reassurance. There is also a transformation in how you relate to time, because when you are not expecting immediate clarity or meaning, there is more patience, more willingness to allow things to unfold, without rushing, without forcing. This patience creates space, for understanding to emerge naturally, for insights to develop over time, for growth to happen in its own rhythm. There is also a deeper appreciation for the ordinary, because when you are not constantly seeking something more significant, you begin to notice what is already here. Small moments, simple experiences, subtle changes, things that may have been overlooked before. This appreciation creates a sense of richness, a feeling that life is not empty even when it appears simple, that there is depth in what is often dismissed as ordinary. There is also a quiet trust that begins to form, not based on evidence, not based on feeling, but based on experience, on seeing that life continues, that things unfold, that meaning often becomes clear in hindsight. This trust is not dramatic. It does not need to be. It is steady, consistent, present, even when nothing seems to be happening. As this trust grows, the need for moments to look spiritual begins to fade, because you start to see that the spiritual is not separate from the ordinary. It is present within it, within daily experiences, within simple actions, within moments that do not stand out. This changes how you experience life. It removes the division between what is considered meaningful and what is not. It brings everything into the same space, a space where life is simply unfolding without needing to be labeled or defined. There is also a deeper sense of ease that develops, because you are no longer searching for something more, no longer waiting for a special moment. You are here, with what is, and that is enough. This does not remove challenges, but it changes how they are experienced. They are no longer seen as interruptions, but as part of the path, as part of the unfolding, as part of the process of living. There is also a subtle shift in identity, because when you are not defining your path based on how it feels, there is less pressure to be a certain way, less need to appear calm or centered or aligned at all times, more freedom to be real, to experience the full range of life without judgment. This creates authenticity, a way of being that is not forced, that is not shaped by expectations, but by presence. Over time, this way of relating to life becomes natural, less effortful, more integrated. Trust is no longer something you try to create. It is something that exists quietly in the background, supporting your movement, even when you are not thinking about it. And from this place, something shifts. Life no longer needs to look a certain way for you to trust it. It no longer needs to feel a certain way for you to believe in it. It is enough that it is happening, that you are here, that you are moving through it. And in that simplicity, there is a kind of peace, not because everything is clear, but because clarity is no longer required for trust to exist. You are able to stay, to continue, to move forward, even when nothing about the moment feels special, because you understand something deeper, that life does not need to look spiritual to be meaningful, that growth does not need to feel profound to be real, that trust does not need constant confirmation to be true, and in that understanding, there is freedom, a release from the need to define every moment, a return to simply living, fully, presently, without needing it to be anything other than what it is. And in that presence, something deeper unfolds, quietly, naturally, without needing to be seen, but felt, in the way you move, in the way you respond, in the way you trust, even when nothing looks like it should. And as that deeper trust begins to hold even when nothing looks meaningful on the surface, something even more challenging quietly appears, something the mind resists almost instantly, the simple fact that sometimes there is no clear reason, no explanation, no answer that satisfies the question why. There is a question that rises in difficult moments, not loudly but persistently, a question that searches for meaning, for logic, for something that can make sense of what is happening, and when that answer does not come, a different kind of discomfort begins to grow. There is a weight in not knowing why, a subtle tension that feels unfinished, a sense that something is missing, that something has not been resolved, that without an answer, the experience itself feels incomplete, and so the mind begins to search. It looks for patterns, it creates explanations, it tries to connect events into a story that feels understandable, because understanding feels like control, it feels like stability. It gives the illusion that if something can be explained, it can be managed. But there are moments in life that do not offer that clarity. Moments where no matter how much you think, how much you analyze, how much you try to understand, the reason does not become clear. And this is where humility begins. Not the kind that lowers you, but the kind that softens you, the kind that allows you to step back from the need to know everything. There is a quiet strength in being able to sit with not knowing, to experience something without immediately trying to explain it, to allow life to be what it is, even when it does not make sense. This is not something the mind is used to, because it has been trained to solve, to understand, to create meaning. And when that ability is limited, it can feel like something is wrong. But not knowing is not a failure, it is a space where the mind does not have to control everything, where it can rest from constant explanation. There is also a deeper layer to this, because the need to know why is often connected to a desire for reassurance, a belief that if the reason is understood, then the experience will feel easier to accept, that if there is a purpose, then the pain is justified. But this connection can become a barrier, because it places acceptance behind understanding. It says, I will be okay once I know why. And when that knowing does not come, acceptance is delayed. This creates a loop, a constant waiting, a feeling that something must be resolved before peace can exist. But peace does not always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from letting go of the need for them, from allowing the experience to be what it is without needing to define it. This is where humility becomes important, because it acknowledges the limits of understanding. It recognizes that not everything can be known, that life is larger than the mind's ability to explain it, and in that recognition there is a release, a softening of the need to control. There is also a shift in how you relate to experience, because when you are not focused on why, attention moves to what is, to the present moment, to what can be felt, to what is actually happening rather than what it means. This shift creates a different kind of awareness, one that is more direct, less filtered through thought, more connected to reality. There is also a reduction in mental strain, because the mind is no longer working constantly to find answers. It is allowed to rest, to observe, to be. This rest creates space for clarity to arise naturally if it comes, but also space for acceptance even if it does not. There is also a deeper emotional stability that begins to develop, because when you are not dependent on understanding, your sense of peace is less affected by uncertainty. You are able to remain grounded even when things are unclear, even when reasons are not available. This stability is not based on knowledge, it is based on presence, on the ability to stay with what is happening without needing to change it immediately. There is also a kind of honesty in this, because not knowing requires you to admit that you do not have all the answers, that you cannot fully control or predict life. This honesty removes the pressure to appear certain, to have everything figured out. It allows for a more authentic way of being, one that is open, flexible, responsive. There is also a deeper connection to trust, because when you do not rely on understanding, trust becomes more internal, less dependent on external validation, less tied to specific outcomes. It becomes a quiet confidence that life can be lived even without full clarity. This confidence grows through experience, through moments where you continue moving forward despite not knowing, where you remain present despite uncertainty, where you allow things to unfold without needing immediate explanation. And each time this happens, The need to know weakens. Not completely, but enough to create space. Space for a different kind of relationship with life. There is also a transformation in how you see uncertainty. It is no longer something to eliminate. It becomes something to coexist with. Something that is part of the process, not separate from it. This changes how you respond to it. Instead of resisting, you allow. Instead of forcing answers, you wait. Not passively, but with awareness, with presence. There is also a deeper sense of peace that becomes available, not because everything is understood, but because understanding is no longer required for peace to exist. This peace is quieter, less dramatic, but more stable, because it is not dependent on conditions. It exists even when things are unclear, even when answers are not available. There is also a shift in how time is experienced, because when you are not waiting for answers, there is less delay, less feeling of being stuck, more engagement with the present moment. This creates a sense of movement, even without clear direction. There is also a deeper appreciation for the unfolding of life, because when you are not trying to explain everything, you are more open to experiencing it, more present, more aware. This awareness brings a richness, a depth that is not dependent on understanding, but on being fully here. As this becomes more familiar, not knowing begins to feel less uncomfortable, less threatening, more neutral, even sometimes peaceful, because it is no longer associated with lack, but with openness, with possibility. There is also a subtle shift in identity, because when you are not defined by what you know, there is more space to grow, more flexibility, more openness to change. This creates a lighter sense of self, one that is not fixed, one that can adapt, that can evolve, that is not limited by the need to always understand. And in this way, humility becomes a strength, not a weakness. A strength that allows you to remain steady in uncertainty, to stay present without needing constant answers, to trust without full understanding. This does not mean you stop seeking knowledge. It means you no longer depend on it for peace. You allow it to come when it comes, without forcing it, without needing it to be immediate. Over time, this changes everything, because life is no longer something that must be fully explained. It becomes something that can be lived, experienced, felt, without constant analysis. And in that experience, there is a kind of freedom, a release from the need to control through understanding, a return to simply being, and in that being, something deeper unfolds. Not through explanation, but through presence, through awareness, through a quiet trust that does not require answers to exist. And from that place, life continues, unfolding, moving, changing, without needing to be fully understood for you to remain at peace within it. And as that quiet humility settles in, as the need to understand every reason begins to soften, something else slowly comes into view, something that has been shaping your reactions for a long time without being fully seen, something that only becomes clear when life does not go the way you expected. There is a moment when something breaks, not loudly, but deeply, when what you thought would happen does not happen, when what you counted on shifts, when what you believed in does not hold the way you imagined. And in that moment, there is a reaction that feels stronger than the situation itself, a sharp disappointment, a tightness in the chest, a sense that something important has been taken away. But beneath that reaction, there is something more subtle, something that was there long before the moment broke. There was an expectation, quiet, unspoken, sometimes not even fully conscious, a belief about how things should unfold, about how people should act, about how life should respond to your effort, your intention, your hope. And when that expectation breaks, it reveals what was attached to it, because expectations are not just thoughts, they are emotional investments. They carry meaning, they carry weight. They often hold a silent promise that if things go this way, then you will feel secure, fulfilled, at peace. And when that promise is broken, the reaction is not just to the event, it is to the loss of what that expectation represented. This is why broken expectations can feel so intense, because they do not just disrupt a plan. They expose what the mind was holding on to, what it was depending on, what it was quietly relying on for stability. There is a kind of hidden attachment that lives inside expectations. It is not always obvious, because expectations can feel reasonable, they can feel natural, they can even feel justified. But beneath them, there is often a subtle belief that things must happen a certain way for things to feel right. And this belief creates tension, because life does not always follow that path. When expectations are met, there is relief, a sense that things are aligned. But when they are not, there is resistance, a feeling that something is wrong. And this resistance reveals the attachment, because without attachment, there would still be preference, still be desire, but not the same level of disturbance when things do not go as planned. There is a difference between wanting something and needing it to happen a certain way. Attachment turns preference into necessity. It says, this must happen for things to be okay. And when that necessity is not met, the reaction is strong. There is also a deeper layer to this, because expectations are often connected to identity, to how you see yourself, to what you believe your life should look like. And when those expectations break, it can feel like something about you has been challenged, not just externally, but internally. This creates a sense of instability, a feeling that something is not as solid as it once seemed. But this instability also creates an opportunity, because when expectations break, they expose what was hidden. They reveal the attachments that were not fully seen, and in that revelation, there is a chance to understand yourself more deeply, to see what you were holding on to recognize where your sense of peace was tied to external outcomes. This recognition is not always comfortable, because it requires honesty, a willingness to see where attachment exists, without judgment, without trying to immediately fix it, just seeing it clearly. There is also a shift that begins to happen when this is seen, because once an attachment is recognized, it loses some of its power. It is no longer invisible. It is no longer operating in the background without awareness. It becomes something that can be observed, something that can be understood. And in that understanding, there is space to respond differently, space to not react in the same way. There is also a deeper sense of freedom that becomes possible, because when you are not tied to specific expectations, there is less pressure on life to unfold in a certain way. There is more openness, more flexibility, more willingness to accept different outcomes. This does not mean you stop having hopes or intentions. It means you hold them lightly, without turning them into rigid demands, without making them the condition for your peace. There is also a transformation in how disappointment is experienced, because when expectations are not held tightly, their breaking does not create the same level of pain. There is still feeling, still emotion, but it is not as heavy, not as overwhelming, because it is not tied to a strong attachment. This creates a more balanced emotional experience, one that allows for response without being consumed. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form, that life does not exist to meet expectations, that it moves according to its own conditions, its own timing, its own unfolding. And when this is understood, there is less resistance when things do not go as planned. There is more acceptance, more alignment with reality. This alignment reduces suffering, because it removes the constant conflict between what is and what is expected. There is also a shift in how you relate to others, because expectations are often placed on people, on how they should behave, on how they should respond, and when those expectations are not met, It can create frustration, disappointment, even resentment. But when attachment to those expectations is released, there is more space for others to be as they are, more acceptance, more understanding. This does not mean tolerating harmful behavior. It means not imposing rigid expectations that create unnecessary tension. There is also a deeper compassion that develops, because when you see your own attachments, you begin to understand how others may be holding on to their own. This creates empathy, a recognition that everyone is navigating their own expectations, their own attachments, their own responses to life. There is also a sense of lightness that begins to appear, because when expectations are not held tightly, there is less pressure on every situation, less need for things to go a certain way, more ease in allowing life to unfold. This ease does not remove effort, but it changes its quality. Effort becomes more natural, less forced, less driven by the need to control outcomes. Over time, broken expectations are no longer seen only as disappointments. They become signals, indicators of where attachment exists, opportunities to see more clearly, to understand more deeply. This does not mean seeking disappointment, but it means not fearing it, not seeing it as something purely negative. There is also a deeper trust that begins to develop, a trust that even when expectations are not met, life continues, that new paths can emerge, that different outcomes can still hold value. This trust reduces the fear of things not going as planned. It allows for a more open approach to life, a willingness to move without needing guarantees. There is also a shift in how you experience the present moment, because when expectations are not dominating attention, there is more presence, more awareness of what is actually happening. This presence creates a richer experience, one that is not filtered through constant comparison, one that allows for direct engagement with life. As this becomes more familiar, the need to hold on to expectations begins to fade, not completely, but enough to create space. Space for flexibility, for openness, for a different way of relating to life. And in that space, something changes. Life feels less rigid, less controlled, more dynamic, more responsive. And within that responsiveness, there is a kind of peace. Not because everything goes as expected, but because expectations are no longer the measure of what is good or bad. Life is experienced more directly, more fully, without the constant need to shape it into a specific form. And in that experience, there is freedom, a release from the need to hold on to what was imagined, a return to what is real, and from that reality, something new can unfold, not limited by past expectations, but open to what is possible now. And in that openness, there is a deeper connection to life itself, not as something to control, but as something to move with, to learn from, to experience, without needing it to match what was once expected. And in that shift, the breaking of expectations becomes something different, not just loss, but revelation, a way of seeing what was hidden, a way of understanding what was held, a way of moving towards something more aligned, more open, more free. And as those broken expectations begin to reveal what was quietly held beneath them, something even more intimate comes into focus, something that does not live in plans or outcomes, but in the way you relate to your own pain, the way you meet it, the way you try to handle it, the way you silently bargain with it. There is a conversation that happens inside you when pain appears. It is not always spoken out loud, but it is constant. A quiet negotiation, a series of conditions, a subtle exchange where the mind says, I will accept this if it changes soon. I will tolerate this if it leads to something better. I will be okay if this goes away. And beneath those conditions, there is resistance, a refusal to fully allow what is being felt. A hope that pain can be reshaped, reduced, controlled, or traded for something more comfortable. At first, this seems reasonable. It feels natural to want pain to end, to look for ways to ease it, to hope that it will pass quickly. But this negotiation creates a tension, because pain does not respond to conditions. It does not leave because it has been reasoned with. It does not change because the mind demands it. And so the negotiation continues, over and over, creating a loop where pain is not fully experienced, but not fully released either. This is where suffering deepens, not because pain is present, but because it is being resisted in a subtle, ongoing way. There is a difference between feeling pain and negotiating with it. Feeling pain is direct, it is immediate, it is honest. Negotiating with pain adds layers, thoughts, conditions, expectations. It turns a simple experience into a complex struggle, because the mind is no longer just feeling. It is trying to manage, to control, to find a way out. But this effort often prolongs what it is trying to end. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from this, a quiet fatigue that builds when the mind is constantly trying to change what is being felt. It becomes heavy, not just emotionally, but physically. The body carries the tension. The breath becomes shallow, the mind becomes restless, always looking for a way to resolve what cannot be resolved through effort alone. There is also a deeper fear beneath this negotiation, a fear that if pain is fully allowed, it will overwhelm, that it will take over, that it will not end. So the mind tries to keep it at a distance, to control the exposure, to limit the intensity. But this distance prevents something important from happening. It prevents the natural movement of pain. Because pain, when allowed, has a rhythm. It rises, it peaks, it falls. But when it is resisted, it becomes stuck. It loses its natural flow. It remains present longer than it needs to, not because it is meant to stay, but because it is not being allowed to move. There is a shift that begins when this pattern is seen clearly, when you notice the negotiation, the subtle conditions, the quiet resistance, and instead of continuing that pattern, something softens, not forced, not dramatic, just a simple willingness to stop arguing, to stop bargaining, to stop trying to control what is being felt. This does not mean liking the pain. It does not mean agreeing with it. It means allowing it, letting it be present without trying to reshape it, without trying to make it something else. This allowing creates space, space where pain can move, where it can be experienced fully, without interference. And in that space, something begins to change. The intensity may still be there, but the struggle around it begins to fade. There is less tension, less resistance, more openness. This openness does not remove pain immediately, but it changes the experience of it. It becomes less complicated, less layered, more direct. And in that directness, there is a kind of clarity, a sense that what is being felt is not something to be solved, but something to be experienced. There is also a deeper trust that begins to develop, a trust in the body, in its ability to process, to move through emotion, to release what is held. This trust is not based on certainty, it is based on experience, on seeing that when pain is allowed, it changes. It does not stay in the same form. It evolves, it shifts, it eventually softens. There is also a release of control that happens here, because the need to manage every feeling begins to fade. The mind no longer feels responsible for fixing everything. It becomes quieter, more observant, less reactive. This quietness creates a different kind of presence, one that is not trying to escape, but is fully here with what is happening. There is also a deeper connection to the body, because when pain is not being resisted, it can be felt more clearly, not just as a concept, but as a physical experience, as sensations, as movement, as energy. This connection grounds the experience. It brings it out of the abstract and into the real. And in that reality, it becomes more manageable, more understandable, not through thought, but through direct experience. There is also a kind of compassion that begins to emerge, because when you stop negotiating with pain, you begin to see it differently, not as an enemy, not as something to fight, but as something that is part of being human, something that deserves space, that deserves attention, that deserves to be felt. This compassion softens the experience. It reduces the harshness, the judgment, the resistance. And in that softness, there is healing, not as something forced, but as something that happens naturally as a result of allowing. There is also a shift in how time is experienced, because when you are not waiting for pain to end, there is less urgency, less impatience, more presence. This presence allows the experience to unfold at its own pace, without pressure, without expectation. And in that unfolding, there is movement, even if it is slow, even if it is subtle. There is also a deeper understanding that develops, that pain is not permanent, that it does not define you, that it is part of a process, not the whole of it. This understanding reduces fear. It creates space for the experience to be what it is without becoming something larger. Over time, the habit of negotiating begins to fade, not completely, but enough to create a different pattern, one where pain is met with awareness rather than resistance, with openness rather than control. This pattern creates a different relationship with life, one that is not based on avoiding discomfort, but on being able to move through it with presence, with trust. There is also a sense of freedom that begins to appear, because when you are not constantly trying to change what you feel, there is less pressure, less effort, more ease. This ease does not come from the absence of pain. It comes from the absence of resistance. And in that ease, there is a kind of peace. Not because everything feels good, but because everything is allowed. As this becomes more familiar, something shifts. Pain no longer feels like something that must be solved immediately. It becomes something that can be experienced and released, something that does not need to be held, something that does not need to be negotiated. And in that shift, healing begins, not as a goal, not as something to achieve, but as a natural result of allowing what is, of stopping the constant effort to control, of letting the experience move through without interference. And from that place, something deeper unfolds, a sense of wholeness. Not because nothing is painful, but because nothing is being resisted, a sense of completeness, not because everything is resolved, but because everything is allowed. And in that allowing, life continues, flowing, changing, unfolding, without needing to be negotiated, without needing to be controlled, without needing to be anything other than what it is. And in that flow, there is healing, quiet, natural, unforced, arising from the simple act of letting go of the need to fix what is already moving on its own. Life was never meant to follow your plans perfectly. It was meant to reveal you to yourself. Every moment you resisted, every time you tried to control, every time you waited for clarity before trusting, it only made the weight heavier. But the moment you softened, the moment you stopped arguing with reality, stopped forcing timelines, stopped negotiating with pain, something changed. You didn't lose control, you found peace. Surrender was never about giving up. It was about letting go of the fight that was draining you. It was about trusting that even in confusion, even in delay, even in loss, life is still moving, still shaping you, still guiding you in ways your mind cannot yet understand. And maybe that's the real shift. Not that life suddenly becomes easy, but that you become steady within it. If something in this touched you, write "I trust the process" in the comments. Not for me, but for yourself. Let it be a quiet decision, a reminder that even if nothing is going your way, something